Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Urban Forest for All. I'm Emily. I'm a senior project coordinator with the National Trust. Um, this is the launch of the Urban Forest Accelerator Toolkit, which has been produced in partnership with National Trust, Woodland Trust, Community Forest Trust, alongside Birmingham City Council and Birmingham Tree People. So we're really happy that you could join us today to explore a bit of it. So this is the result as well of a 2-year project, which we'll explain a bit more about later. This session is the last in a series of webinars looking at our new Nature Towns and Cities programme, which feels fitting as we didn't want this to be a conclusion of anything or a finished product. So we're hoping to share what we've been building and think about how we use it in the future. So the plan for today is to take this as a bit of a moment of reflection and then look at how we work with these resources in greater depth with more places over the next few years. Next slide, please. A bit of very basic housekeeping. I'm sure you've all been on Zoom webinars before, but we've got a separate Q&A and chat function. If you've got any very specific questions for our speakers or panelists, please ask them, pop them in the Q&A function, just so that we can make sure they get to the right person. Anything in the chat, tree related talk, thoughts, comments, introduce yourself, let us know where you're joining from, and any technical questions, just pop them in the chat. Automatic captioning is turned on, so if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a little CC button. You can turn that on to get a text translation of the audio at any point. This session is being recorded, so it's going to be uploaded to our Nature Towns and Cities website sometime over the next week or so. Finally, we've got an interactive whiteboard for this session as well, because we've got lots to share with you, but we're very aware of the expertise in the room, so we'd love you to put your thoughts, answer some questions on there as we go through. So the link to that will be in the chat. If you've got any difficulties with it, just pop us a question, pop us a comment in the chat. Next slide, please. This is just a very brief overview of how we're going to run. Obviously, it's a slightly longer webinar, so please feel free to dip in and out as you like. We're going to have a keynote speech shortly from Cecil Konijnendijk, and then a session that's an in-conversation session about preparing your organisation. We'll then have a short break before coming back to our community engagement and tree equity panel discussion. And finally, we'll have a session on funding the urban forest. And that's how today's going to run, and that's about everything I need to tell you, I think. So I am going to hand over to our project manager for Urban Forest Accelerator, David Coughlin.
Hello, thanks, Emily. So I'm just here for a short introduction, a little bit on the project, and to introduce Cecil, as Emily mentioned. The project, as Emily also mentioned, is a partnership between the Community Forest Trust, National Trust and Woodland Trust, as well as our core delivery partners, Birmingham City Council and Birmingham Tree People. The aim has been to learn from Birmingham about how they are starting to implement their pioneering urban forest master plan. So we'll hear a little bit about that today. The project's been funded by Trees Call to Action Fund, which was developed by DEFRA in partnership with the Forestry Commission and delivered by the Heritage Fund. But we didn't want during the project to just be learning from the experiences of Birmingham and producing a tailor-made set of products for Birmingham. So we've drawn in expertise and knowledge of a range of other places and organisations. I would just take a good moment to thank everyone who's contributed. It's impossible to go through them all, but we've, through a series of workshops, had the input of 62 organisations, 115 individuals, and outside of those formal workshops, over 1,000 hours of conversation with experts. But just in the actual production of the toolkit that you can see at the link in the Miro board, I think it's just important to shout out exceptional contributions from Emily, who you just heard from, Joe Dix, who's our copywriter, and also Iris and Birch, who put the whole thing together. So just special thanks to them. Throughout the whole project, we've been trying to build incrementally on existing practice, adding where we can to what is an enormous amount of high quality and extensive expertise already out there. So today we're launching this Urban Forest Accelerator Toolkit as an attempt to codify and share some of what was learned through this project, a small part of all expertise and knowledge of the subject. The toolkit is split into 4 sections: preparing your organization, increasing tree equity, involving communities, and then funding that work, which is a structure we'll broadly follow today. So could you just go to the next slide, please, Mona? Thanks. It's by no means the sum of all knowledge on urban forestry, as I said. Instead, it's taking the principles and the tool of tree equity, which we know is, the principles behind that have been used for a long time in various guises, but trying to understand what can be added when that's applied in a really systematic way. So it's not a case of radically reimagining or launching a completely new way of doing things, but of understanding what works and how we can all do more of that together. So we are launching a set of resources, but we're not planning to just publish and leave this there on the internet for people to seek out themselves. We'll be building on this in partnership and supporting places to put more of this into practice. So it's there for you to view, but as it's not the end of our work, today's really about exploring a lot of the content in depth. Next slide, please, Mona. So you'll be hearing from a range of people today. Here is a very quick snapshot of all of them to avoid any surprising faces popping up. And then next slide again, please. Cool. So now you get to look at a picture of me and Cecil and hear from me, which is a bit strange. But with all of that out of the way, it's just time to introduce Cecil Konijnendijk for our keynote speech. So if what we want are livable, healthy, climate positive places, trees, large and long living as they are, can play a big role in that. People need trees in their cities, but trees also need people. And that's why we think about the urban forest as a single ecosystem of people and trees in mutually supportive roles. The urban forest is a core component of all green infrastructure, but in our towns and cities, trees compete with a landscape more dynamic than almost any in nature. I'm sure some nature people might disagree with that. And that's why it's really important for us as tree professionals to engage with others outside of arboriculture or urban forestry professionals in the built environment, as many of you do already, inviting them into our spaces and trying to get our way into theirs. Next slide, please. Thanks. But so on the other side of that sort of challenging dynamic urban landscape, in a sort of natural capital sense, trees nearer to more people could deliver significantly more benefit. Catherine Nutgens, who worked with us on the first half of this project, repeatedly advocated for us viewing trees as essential infrastructure, like our roads, utilities, lampposts. The England Tree Action Plan says this: we want to make sure trees in the urban environment are no longer seen as a management liability because of the costs, rather that they're seen as an important asset. And alongside that England Tree Action Plan, there are a number of major opportunities presenting themselves currently or coming up. So whether that's how urban trees are considered in local nature recovery strategies or in biodiversity net gain, or what could upcoming updates to the national planning policy offer next year, there's a lot of questions and a lot of things for us to consider how we make the most of them. Next slide, please. So whilst considering how we expand canopy cover, and that's both through proactive maintenance as well as planting, we should always be guided by principles of equity. The case is really quite clear. Neighbourhoods where people have the highest income have more than double the tree cover compared to neighbourhoods where with the lowest income. Neighbourhoods where tree cover is the highest have roughly 30% less nitrogen dioxide pollution, 10% less particulate pollution, and are on average 4 degrees cooler during heat waves. Neighbourhoods where people identify with a minority ethnic group have on average about 50% less canopy cover. And this report from Public Health England, where they've even pointed out that the benefit of greening is disproportionately large for disadvantaged groups. So without much more chat from me, I'd just like to welcome Cecil to situate all of our work in the international movement for urban forestry. Cecil is the director of the Nature-Based Solutions Institute and an honorary professor at the University of British Columbia. Amongst a huge body of his work is the 3-30-300 rule, which I think is a really simple and evocative way to bake in some of that equitable approach to urban forestry, if I can put my own read on it, Cecil. And for me, it's a really valuable reminder that creating the conditions for happy, healthy lives in the face of climate catastrophe is an increasing urbanization is a global challenge. So yeah, it's really great to have you here, Cecil. I will pass over to you.
Thank you so much, David, and yeah, congratulations on this important meeting. And I'm really happy to be with you to provide a little bit of wider context, as it were. And I think you already mentioned, David, some of the key topics, right, that we are seeing today when it comes to urban trees, urban forest in our cities, not just in the UK, but in Europe and globally as well. So yeah, the wider framing for me really starts with a Dutch slide. And don't worry, I am going to give you a little bit of interpretation of that. Actually, the title here is in English. We had a recent study, actually it's about half a year ago or so, by a foundation called Steenbreek, which basically means break the stone. So they're really working hard to green neighborhoods across the Netherlands. And they did a countrywide study showing that about half of the Dutch residents with a garden or a balcony actually really regularly finds it too hot when they're in the garden or on the balcony. So I think this really shows that climate change is here to experience for all of us. It's no longer something which is abstract, which we see in the news, but really sometimes cannot relate to. But of course, we see it, we feel it. And of course, the recent storm you had in the UK again, with all the damage, devastating damage also to trees, shows it once again that we are living in a much more volatile climate time. And of course, here urban forestry does play a role. On the one hand, it is affected by climate change, but of course also, and this is really the focus of our work, we can do things to adapt our communities to climate change by cooling, by stormwater regulation, but also by dealing, for example, with some of the side effects like increased air pollution. And of course, then all of this should be done from a kind of an equity perspective, making sure that green spaces, trees are seen as this essential infrastructure, as we heard earlier. So the good thing is really that in the recent few years, we've seen a rapid uptake of this thinking on climate change, on public health benefits, also other benefits of urban trees in policy at different levels. So we already saw the England Trees Action Plan as an example in the UK, in England, but also European-wide. Of course, we have the Nature Restoration Law in the EU, which actually calls for the first time for setting canopy targets and even also a percentage of green space within urban areas. So there's really a push towards not only recognizing the benefits of trees and green spaces, but also taking that up as a policy incentive or policy responsibility at the higher levels, the national and the international level, as well as setting some very clear targets for delivering policy and monitoring impact of policy. Well, of course, the United States is a great example of that. Under the Biden administration, still in office for a few weeks, they had this historic investment of $1.5 billion in trees, in especially vulnerable communities throughout the United States, which was an immense increase of the urban forest budget, federal budget in the United States. So yeah, definitely not only big words, but also funding going towards urban trees, both existing and new. So my own work, I've been working quite a bit with government at different levels during recent years. And one of the examples of this is work with the Flemish government in Belgium, who asked us, a group of consultants, to look at the health benefits of urban forests and urban trees, and then really to try to see, well, if we want to invest in urban forest, where do we get the biggest health benefits? And not surprisingly, and David already mentioned that, increasing canopy cover is really one of the big gains where we can really make a difference in terms of mental health, social health, physical health, but also things like bringing in more small parks, pocket parks into neighborhoods, increasing the amount of community gardens, as well as the greening of school grounds and schoolyards. These are some of the areas where we should really focus some of our attention based on the latest research. Well, some of you may have seen this research coming out of the Barcelona Institute of Global Health, pretty influential for some of the work I've been doing. They related in 93 European cities the amount of canopy cover to temperature reduction, especially during heat waves. And then they could also make a link based on epidemiological findings to actually the number of people we could save during heat waves, people who would die prematurely. If not, we would cool neighborhoods. And this, by reaching 30% canopy cover, we could save up to 1/3 of what we call premature deaths during heat waves. And I can tell you, when I communicate with politicians, as I do a lot these days, this is really one of the strong arguments for more urban forest, better urban forest in our cities, to really cool neighborhoods and actually, yeah, keep people healthier for a longer time. Of course, there's often the call for tools, and the Urban Forest Accelerator provides a new toolkit, which is really excellent, and also for guidance for policy, as local authorities across the world are trying to find ways of improving urban forests in their communities. They ask for some guidance, some principles to work with. In work I did for the Nordic Council of Ministers, I came up with 4 principles, and these are definitely not comprehensive, right? There could be other principles as well, but the idea of proximity, making sure that everybody has access to urban forest, urban green, including visibility, as we found during the COVID pandemic, right? The importance of visual green when we are not so mobile, when we're actually locked into certain areas. It's really important also to be able to see green and trees, and more research is actually showing that as well. Connectivity, obviously, making sure we have well-connected green spaces in urban forest, also in terms of people being connected through green spaces. It's the idea of diversity, so things like, of course, biodiversity, but also a diversity of green experiences throughout our communities, and also reflecting the diversity of our communities. People of different backgrounds, different ages, different histories, also come with their own package of desires and wishes of what kind of nature and urban trees they would like to see around them. And of course, this should be reflected also in our urban forests. And then finally, obviously, it's already been mentioned, the idea of equity, tree equity, urban forest equity, and making sure that really the benefits of urban forest are not exclusive, but are really brought to all parts of the community. And this is easily said, but not always easily done, as we really have to work with a heritage of unfair distribution of urban forest in many of our communities. Here, actually, we see interesting differences across the world. So we see in the UK, US, that often, more vulnerable neighborhoods, lower income neighborhoods have lower urban forest cover, while, for example, in the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, etc., this trend, this correlation is not so clear, because actually governments have been more eager to bring trees and green to also to weaker social groups over time. So this is actually interesting to see that trend is not always the same across the world. Yeah, just a few of the initiatives that we see worldwide today. Of course, we have really seen over the last decades a development of a global community, of a movement, also of a science of urban forestry, with journals, with conferences, also in the UK. But also, I think very interestingly, kind of a push towards scoring systems or awards systems, like the Tree Cities of the World program, but also the World Green Cities Award. There's all kind of wishes now for communities, for cities to benchmark themselves and maybe also be rewarded for the work they're doing in greening. And I think this trend has really intensified during the last few years. So that also brings me then to the idea of having good metrics for not only developing, designing policy and strategy, but also finding ways of actually monitoring and following up on the implementation of these policies. This report appeared in the UK about a year ago, Greening Up by Create Streets and the Berkeley Group. And they're actually trying to find good metrics for, okay, how, if we want to green our communities, especially streets and other public spaces, how could we, what kind of metrics could we use for doing that? And they talk about 2 types of metrics, kind of the exposure to green, which could be a more passive way of making sure we have trees and green around us wherever we are in the city or the town, but also access metrics. So how can we make sure that people have easy access to parks and green spaces and can easily come to those? And they actually say in the report, well, we should actually really have hybrid metrics that look at both exposure and access when it comes to recreation and to the health benefits of green spaces and trees. Well, interesting enough, they actually recommend as one of these hybrid metrics the 330-300 rule or principle or guideline, whatever you want to call it, which I launched in February 2021. And the fact that this has gotten so much uptake, I think, worldwide, shows really this need and this call for metrics, for policy guidance, for ways of mobilizing communities, for communicating the benefits of urban trees. Just in brief, of course, it calls for 3 large trees, mature trees, to be seen from every home, every workplace, school, or place of care. At least 30% canopy cover in the neighborhood rather than as a community average or city average. And finally, in line with the World Health Organization's recommendation, to have no more than 300 meter to a high quality public space, a park, a woodland, etc. Yeah, and this has really taken off pretty rapidly. And I think one of the strengths, of course, for metrics like this is really to have a pretty solid evidence base, in this case really linked to health and climate action, climate adaptation. So the viewing trees, the 3 trees, the visible greens, and its effect it has on mental health especially, our ability to concentrate, to perform, to be creative, living under trees and canopies as a tool to cool our neighborhoods, but also to create, for example, social meeting places and improve other health issues. And of course, the more traditional recreational use of green, of woodland, of parks, for example, also for physical well-being, but once again, also for social interactions. So I think these 3 components, visual, surrounding green, as well as recreational green, that's maybe the strength of a metric like this, and explains parts of its popularity. But what I really like about it is this is not only a policy tool, this is not only a monitoring tool, but it's also a public action tool. Greenpeace Belgium did a campaign recently where they had all of Belgium, all municipalities mapped for the 330-300. And they also did a campaign together with the local elections in Belgium, where they actually went out and put these tree stickers on municipal name tags, name signs. Funny enough, not 3 trees, sometimes 3 trees, sometimes also 4 trees. And they called for what they call tree plans in these municipalities as well. So it's really a great way, I think, to communicate the need for more trees and also for local politics to increase tree cover. And yeah, this links also really to the need for not only planting trees, which of course is a great thing to do. It's very sexy, it's very interesting for politicians, but really also for making sure that we keep our trees, we make sure they get older, they get bigger, and we plant them in the right way, right? So they actually have the space to grow underground and above ground. And recent research really shows that from a mental health perspective, for example, people really do prefer larger trees in their neighborhood, to the extent that actually, for example, mental health medication drops if there are more large trees in your neighborhood. And this was a study by the KU Leuven in Brussels. In the Netherlands, we took one step further than the 330-300, but we actually looked especially at the 30 component and then tried to see, well, how much not only tree canopy cover, but also tree crown volume would we need to actually provide good living environments, because really a tree, of course, is not 2-dimensional, it's 3-dimensional. So this tree crown volume norm is now launched as a countrywide tree norm in the Netherlands. It basically says that, to have a good neighborhood, you should have at least 2.2 cubic meters of crown volume per square meter in your neighborhood. And this is now gradually being taken up. It gives you a little bit more flexibility than just a 30% canopy. You can actually work with fewer but larger trees, for example, to meet it. For the 330-300, of course, it's crucial, as with any resource assessment and monitoring, that you actually really do some careful mapping, as the city of Malmö has been doing. So they have been looking at 3 different typical neighborhoods in Malmö, and then they've been comparing what is the current canopy cover here, and what could we realistically achieve over the next decades, just on public land, just by looking at where is the space to plant more trees. And for all 3 neighborhood types, from the inner city urban to the more suburban residential neighborhoods, a doubling of tree canopy cover is actually possible. But of course, that requires hard choices. It requires prioritization of trees over, for example, car habitat. But I would expect that we're going to take some different choices in our cities as we go along. The 330-300 was recently also featured in an article in Nature Communications. A lot of media attention around it, comparing 8 large cities in the world, showing that cities like Singapore and Seattle are scoring very well on the 330-300, while cities like Amsterdam have a lot to do. And for example, in terms of 30%, Amsterdam has 0% buildings in the city that actually meets the 30% target. So quite big differences. You see, for example, New York has 92% buildings that can see 3 trees or more. So yeah, there are definitely some interesting points to start from. And this is really being picked up also as a tool to develop tree charters, tree policies. For example, here in the metropolitan region of Nantes in France, a new tree charter where the 330-300 is kind of the guiding principle. On all the 330-300 maps, you see very dark red spots that are often industrial and business areas. So areas where we traditionally have not really focused on green, although people do spend a lot of time on these areas. And it would be really important to think more nature inclusively here, develop greener business areas, industrial areas. And there's a new project in the Netherlands called Working Landscapes of the Future that is looking into that. So coming to the final part of my my talk today, of course, there's also quite some pushback against metrics like the 330-300. They are simplifying things. They create a lot of interest, a lot of discussion, but of course, from there on, you really have to take it a step further. For example, the idea of not only looking at biodiversity, but also biocultural diversity. So the way how diverse ecosystems and diverse people systems, societies are actually jointly shaping our landscapes. And here you can think about bringing in more variety, diversity into our neighborhoods through the 330-300 as well. It's not only about the quantity, single species, etc. It's really about a diverse and resilient and interesting green structure that we should develop. And in my book, Rethinking Urban Green Spaces, I kind of take that metric and then break it down and say, well, how do we give meaning to simple numbers, right? How can you actually work with concepts that are culturally meaningful, that actually help deliver some of the thinking, for example, in terms of creating a new type of grove in our city. That could be the 300 component, developing streets that are also linear forests, as in the words of Stefano Mancuso and others, the street woods, and then also to have special relationships built up with doorstep trees that are local and that are our own and we actually acknowledge on a regular basis. So yeah, urban forestry is really a global field now, so it's really great to see that context is there. We have the World Forum on Urban Forest. In Europe, we have the European Forum. That was really the inspiration for this. And also we have organizations like the Sustainable Forestry Initiative in North America now coming with a urban and community forestry standard to guide not only the management of urban forest across North America, but potentially also the world, but also find ways of maybe certifying urban forests over time. So really interesting developments. And of course, this connects to ideas of place, not just creating places, but also really making sure that we keep places and we build quality and we engage communities over time. That's really the key challenge, I think, of urban forestry. Yeah, finally, there's a lot of players. These are some of the land owners, apart from municipal, local authorities and national bodies, but actually there are a lot of different organizations now, and I put some of the organizers of this event in the center here, people that are involved, NGOs that are involved in urban forestry. And for the 330-300, I just made a quick assessment the other day that these are some of the companies, for example, that have now taken this up as a tool, as an instrument, and actually the business sector is getting more engaged in urban forestry as well and are an important player to consider. So yeah, just some concluding thoughts. Really a need for visions and long-term plans, not to get stuck in the day-to-day of what are the limitations, but really try to think long-term as our cities are changing. The integration of policy with the green, with health, with planning, with tourism, with climate, creating partnerships and alliances as you've been doing, this idea of kind of a mosaic governance, which is much more complex. The importance of peer networking, learning and celebrating together. Urban forest equity should be really an underlying principle for all of these activities. As we map and monitor, we measure impact, we grow older and bigger trees, and we do both placemaking and keeping, while also maybe moving from a stewardship to a kind of custodianship approach. So thanks so much for listening. I packed a lot in here, but hopefully it gives a bit of a framing and context for the remainder of this webinar. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Cecil. That was really fascinating, and I think a perfect introduction to everything we're going to be talking about. That idea of biocultural diversity for me is really useful to think about, and I think the sort of balance between nuance and simplification and usability for metrics as well, I think, is probably especially relevant for this next conversation, which is going to sort of I think build really nicely on what you've been talking about, to talk about how local authorities specifically take all of that thinking and those metrics and that sort of large scale vision and ambition and put it into practice. So one of the reasons that local authorities are really well placed to manage and regenerate urban forests is their integrative mandate across various agendas. Wide-ranging benefits that urban forests can deliver also mean there's a need to bring a wide range of collaborators on board, both to support the effort and maximise impact for people. What is needed, according to, I think, something that you drafted, Cecil, the UN Economic Commission for Europe policy brief on urban forestry, an integrated, interdisciplinary, participatory and strategic approach to planning and managing forest and tree resources in urban and peri-urban areas for economic, environmental and sociocultural benefits. That's a pretty complicated task, packing probably years and years of work into a single sentence. So how do authorities organize all of that, from the vision to the delivery, through all the political considerations, maybe, let's say, in between? What we do know is that places need time, resource, people and expertise to do that. Things that are precious and in ever shortening supply as pressures on local authority budgets increase. One of the highlights for me within the toolkit that we're publishing, which situates all of that developmental work within competing pressures of local government, is a piece that Plymouth City Council and Plymouth and South Devon Community Forest carried out on within the toolkit. We're sharing something that is a summary of a really comprehensive plan looking at factors that enabled the community forest to advance to where it has, and then essential ingredients for future growth. So now we're going to hear two conversations with people who've been through this strategizing process. Firstly, Simon Needle, strategic lead for urban forestry and nature at Birmingham City Council, talking to Adam Cormack, head of campaigning at Woodland Trust, and talking about the urban forest master plan for Birmingham. Adam
Thank
and
you,
Simon.
David. Thanks,
right,
David.
there. Thanks. All right.
Great. Okay, so for the next 15 minutes, Simon and I are going to talk about I'm going to ask Simon questions, and Simon's going to talk about developing the Urban Forest Master Plan for Birmingham. So I just thought I'd start, Simon, by just reading out the vision from the start of the document. So it says, which was launched in 2021. And on its opening page, it says the overall vision for Birmingham's urban forestry programme is having more trees for Birmingham that deliver benefits for health, nature and climate change for all the communities within the city, now and in the future, as part of an inclusive and sustainable urban forest. So that's what it's all about. Now, I remember coming to a webinar in 2022 where you spoke, and I think Kenton from Treeconomics was there and Mac from Birmingham Tree People. And at the time, you were describing this urban forest master plan as the UK's first, and potentially even the first in Europe. So before we get into the development of the Birmingham document, which we'll do in a minute or two, maybe just reflecting back on your career and the kind of, the sort of processes for strategic urban forest planning up until you wrote that plan in 2021 for Birmingham. How would you characterise those?
Thanks, Adam. I think that's a good question. I think it's something that I think has been evolving, and I know we've said about this being potentially the first of its kind. I think there's been lots of other plans, lots of policies, and I think this is the thing. Over the years, people have policies set in place, they have management practices, but I suppose we were talking about how do we bring all of these together. So over the years, yes, we've had people who led the management of trees and woodlands within the city. They might have had a set of management practices. Often that was in their head to start off with. Then we started having policies and practices written down. And those policies are great because obviously they set direction, but they talk about the here and now. They don't talk necessarily about the future. So yeah, I think it was something that was evolving, and I think clearly the pace of change within the city was something that was leading towards needing to have a much longer vision and sort of set our destination. And also, I think with a lot of the policies that we have and other plans that are written, there was nothing really about sort of saying what's a measure of our current status as well. And so that's what we wanted to try and bring together. There are lots of other documents, lots of other people have got, management plans or I suppose vision strategies, but not all of those had that sort of measure, that sort of KPI measure of where are we at now, where do we want to get to? And I think that was maybe what we felt sort of set ours apart on that.
And this is a long-term document, isn't it? So just remind everybody what's the sort of time span for the document? Yeah,
so I suppose in tree time it's a blink of the eye, but for us this is this was 2021 to 2051. So we were setting that 30-year timescale. And I know for local authorities, it's always this issue, isn't it, in terms of we're often can be directed by political cycles. So I think this was our sort of want to sort of be on that same sort of level as the other planning policy documents, the other strategic level views that set that longer term vision with, you know, a sort of 2025, 30-year strategy. So we can sort of go beyond that. So we've got momentum to build up that sort of supersedes some of those other local churn that you get in terms of vision and strategy, you know, vision and strategy.
Yeah, and we plan long term for forests elsewhere in the landscape and rural areas, don't we? So
Yeah,
that makes
yeah.
sense. So who else was involved in producing the Urban Forest Master Plan?
Yeah, so we had quite a wide range of people involved in that. So there was myself involved in that from the city council side of things, along with some of our tree officers and planning officers were involved as well. But we couldn't have done this without the partnership with Birmingham Tree People. I mean, they did lobby for the funds to help to sort of draw up and deliver the plan, and then they also were responsible for commissioning Treeconomics to help us along that route, to help us sort of, you know, author the document. Then we pulled in a whole series of stakeholders. So within the city, we've got people like Birmingham Open Spaces Forum, which are an umbrella group for our Friends of Parks groups. So we brought those into the conversation. We worked with our existing urban forest volunteers. We worked with neighbouring authorities, local tree warden groups as well, because we've got a linkage with them. It was interesting to get their perspective from their local authority view to see, you know, what do they think was working well within their local authority, what wasn't, to try and incorporate those. We worked with a whole range of other professionals from other local authorities, third sector, Forest Commission, National Trust. Cecil was also involved in this drawing of the document. So we tried to incorporate everybody from, you know, I suppose interested members of the public, you know, so the volunteers, through to people who are, you know, industry experts, to get a broad range of views and sort of make sure we've got a good balanced set of, you know, aspiration and direction within the document.
Mm. And there was a series of workshops, wasn't there, that fed into it? I went back and did a bit of rereading it before this, and I was really struck by the number of councillors that you had attending. So obviously you had some sort of support and interest from right up to the top of the council for this.
Yeah, so we did have some good support. I mean, our then cabinet member for cabinet member for parks and cabinet member for transport and environment were very supportive of this process. They've been supportive for quite some time, or they have been supportive for quite some time. They're not the cabinet members now, which is that thing about political cycle, I suppose. But yeah, they were really supportive. They've been supportive of our tree planting aspirations over the years. Always been heavily involved in that. So yeah, I think that really added some sort of weight and momentum to it, and it also built on the back of our tree policy review that we undertook in 2017, which was instigated following a bit of a campaign by the public. So Birmingham Trees for Life and other members of the public were campaigning about the loss of trees in the city. That led to this tree policy review, and that was supported by cross-party members as well. So again, we'd got that cross-party support, although it was, you know, the cabinet members who were pushing on this in this point, you know, with the other councillors were all pretty much on board. So it was pretty good.
Great. So I want to just talk a bit about the data now for a few minutes. And you use Tree Plotter to create a sort of prioritization map for urban forestry in the city. And that uses these principles of climate risk and vulnerability assessment. So sort of neighbourhood and ward level mapping that shows areas, it's kind of grade areas by their priority, I guess, for kind of urban forestry efforts for investing resources. So could you just talk us through a bit, like how you went about that? Maybe where did you get any inspiration for that idea? And yeah, how you went about developing it, and maybe a bit on how you've been using it.
Yeah, so I think this was something, I think, for those people who are working out on the ground, if you're in a large urban environment, they're probably, this was a way, I suppose, of visualizing things that perhaps we knew, you had a gut instinct of. If you know your patch, you know sort of roughly what's happening there, you know, the level of trees, etc. So yeah, so we were thinking very much, we've been thinking about this in our tree planting program on the Royalties, but really it was more of that, like I say, that was intuitive and knowledge-based thing. So think about areas where we felt there were fewer trees, areas where we knew there were deprivation. Could we improve the environment around that? There'd been a lot of opportunity to see webinars as well around things like the benefits of urban green infrastructure to people's health and well-being. That was really sort of starting to become on that rise. So yeah, so thinking about what we were looking at, we started off by thinking, what data have we got? We've got data on flood risk within the city, so let's overlay that. We'd also got data on the indices multiple deprivation as well. So when we let's bring that together, and then bring that in with the national tree map data. So we've got the data from Blue Sky on the national tree map, so we could see where we've got high levels of canopy, low levels of canopy, working that at not just it's fine working at the city scale. You know, yes, we could look at the city and go, oh, we've got quite good canopy cover. But when you realise that, when you start breaking it down, that some parts of the city are particularly high, so some of our affluent areas are maybe 49% canopy cover, 39%, you know, and others are really low. When you start getting down to that granularity of constituency and ward, and then bringing it down to that neighbourhood, or we use the lower super output areas to do that, you really notice the stark differences. And then when we pull in on other public health data and things around the numbers of years life lost as well, you start to layer these up and you realise there's a lot of coincidence between these layers. So those areas that were at flood risk also had high levels of deprivation. They were also the areas where there was significant years life lost. Then working with University of Birmingham, we were able to get some sort of urban heat island modelling done as well. So again, when you overlay that, perhaps no surprise that actually that replicates almost all the other maps as well. So you can really see how, you know, green infrastructure, particularly trees, could play a massive part in sort of trying to level up or provide a bit more equity in there.
So you're preaching. Sorry, yeah, you carry on.
Go on. Yeah, so I was going to say.
Well, I was going to say you're preaching to the converted here, because I love maps, and I suspect that like many of the audience do as well. But what's the response been? Because, you know, you've been using the maps for a couple of years now in Birmingham, haven't you?
So I think it's been really useful for us to have that visualization. It was one thing just for us to be saying this. I think being able to present it, and, you know, I think with the tree plotter canopy map, it was a very stark. It's a red or it's green, you know, with shades of orange and yellow in between. So it's a bit like traffic lighting. And I think, you know, that's something that people really can visualize. You know, red is quite clearly bad, and when you realize how much or how many areas there are that are in that way, you know, are in canopy deficit and suffering from climate risk, it brings it home. It's allowed us to have a better conversation with local councillors as well, because we've found that, you know, in the past you'd get a lot of demand for tree planting in certain areas of the city, but they were often areas where they already were doing quite well in terms of either urban trees in gardens or trees in parks. And they weren't areas that were deprived. And I think some of this comes down to the fact that those councillors are having to balance the demand from their residents and those that have got significant sort of social, environmental aspects, you know, whether it's be housing quality or those kind of things. The councillors' time is taken up dealing with those, and so they didn't have the time to shout up and sort of say, actually, we want some trees over here. The ones that didn't have to deal with all of those sort of residents' inquiries were the ones that had the time to think more about the environment. And this is where I think, you know, I think we've spoken about it before, thinking about Maslow's pyramid of needs, that hierarchy, and sort of saying, actually, those with the biggest need often have so many other things to do that need dealing with first, that this is probably quite low down on their agenda. So it's allowed us to have that conversation in both, you know, both words and a graphic sense.
Thanks, Simon. That's fascinating. So I can see the impact that you're having. You know, we at the Woodland Trust have been a bit involved with the development of the trees strategy for Belfast, which very much is modelled, I think, on the Urban Forest Master Plan for Birmingham. So you can kind of see the sort of ripple effects of the work you've been doing. And another project that the Trust has been working on has been the development of the tree equity score for the UK, adapting the work from the States that American forests have done. And, you know, your work in Birmingham was very much one of the kind of reference points for that. You know, the tree equity score produces an LSOA level map, grading of priority, composite measure benefits of trees, looking at heat, air quality, tree cover, many of the things you've mentioned. So I just wanted to mention that for the audience, that's part of the toolkit in terms of like some guidance on how to use and adapt that for use in your own area. And we did a bit of a comparison between the work that you'd done in Birmingham, that sort of deeper dive, and the methodology for the tree equity score, and found there was a pretty broad crossover, probably I'd say circa 80% when you look at the map at a glance. So I think that's a useful insight for people watching, thinking they'd like to do what you've done. They want to get a start. The tree equity score will give you a starting place for that, along with all the other resources in the Urban Forest Accelerator Toolkit. So I just wanted to bring that in. So we've got about a minute left, Simon. So is there anything on your mind that you'd like to tell people about the Urban Forest Master Plan and kind of, how's it going? Maybe we should finish with that.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. It's not much. I think it's one of these things. I think we did say at the time that unlike a lot of policies and other strategies that get put on the shelf, this is one that does need review, and I think that's where a benefit lies as well. So obviously things like COVID have had a bit of an impact in terms of a lag, but we are at a point now where we're bringing together some of the original players and the professionals, and actually we're reviewing the KPIs, seeing how we've moved forward, looking at how we've measured. Are we making advances on that? And hopefully we'll be publishing something around that, probably early to mid next year. So showing how we've progressed from that original assessment. And I think that will help guide and hopefully, fingers crossed, financial situations get a bit better and we can leave in a bit more money for urban tree planting across the city.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, well, thanks for the inspiration and all your work on this project. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Adam.
So David, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Adam. I'm having trouble. Yeah, no, there it is. Thanks very much. That's great. I'm not back for long. Just to very briefly thank you, Adam and Simon, and hand over to Anne Jaluzot, the London Urban Forest Plan Coordinator at Greater London Authority, talking to Victoria Bradford-Keegan from National Trust about the London Urban Forest Plan. I have also seen a question in the Q&A. We don't have time for Q&A in this session, so if we just ask Simon, if you could just have a look in the Q&A and try and get some answers over, that would be really helpful. Thanks. But over to Anne and Victoria. Thanks.
Thanks, David, and welcome, Anne. So we're going to follow the same format as Adam and Simon have just done, and have a little bit of a chat about Anne's work in London. But just to get us started, Anne, could you just say a little bit about yourself and your experience?
Sure. Well, I'm not an urban forester by training. I'm an urban planner, but I've always worked with nature and natural systems as a means to create, great places like Cecil landed on, like great places for people and wildlife. And very quickly, trees became a sort of a key area of focus of my work, because they're probably the largest single, natural asset one can fit in an urban environment. So I worked on this a little bit in the city of Chicago, then in the UK in Cape, working on green infrastructure, but also a little bit on trees. I collaborated for a number of years with the Trees and Action Group, working guides with them and running a consultancy, and now I'm in the TLA.
Great, thank you. That's just really helpful, I think, for people to hear about how people are either navigating through their work on trees or finding trees as a route to outcomes that they're looking to deliver. So we've heard Adam and Simon talk about the importance of having a plan, a delivery plan, it not just being a kind of on-the-shelf thing or in people's heads. Could you tell us a little bit about how this is playing out in London, where you're taking a citywide approach to that planning, some of the challenges, maybe some of the benefits of that approach?
Yes, the London situation is an interesting situation, isn't it? Because it's a regional approach. We're not talking about the management of the Greater London Authority's own tree. It has oh my god, which the authority has very little trees to manage. So it's we're in it to be part of a partnership that we're convening This London Urban Forest Partnership brings together organizations that have a strategic interest in London trees and woodlands. So it includes a wide variety of landowners, including the London boroughs, there's 33 of them, but also Network Rail, Transport for London, Royal Parks. We have a lot of really major landowners, some housing associations who owns large swaths of our housing land. So there's really a diverse set of landowners that are with us. A lot of environmental NGOs who play a really critical role in the expansion and with all the engagement work and the conservation dimension. Some representatives from professional bodies, statutory agencies, research organizations, so a really wide range of professional organizations. We don't directly have representatives from community or community group, but we have representatives of those who engage with those groups. And the London Urban Forest Plan is really the plan of that partnership, and it gives the partnership the opportunity to first and foremost identify and champion some shared priorities, and secondly to enhance its collective ability to deliver on those priorities. So it's very much an engine, the London Urban Forest Plan, for enhancing, you could say, coordination and capacity. And in that sense, it's quite different from a master plan like you have in Belfast and in Birmingham, who are, I think, to a degree serve that purpose, but it's also, there is direct power and ability to make decisions on the management of a set of trees, either there's the public realm trees or it's the trees in the private realm that can be influenced by the planning system. So here, within the London Urban Forest Partnership, it's all through the convening power and access and influencing, and having this lever of influencing rather than having direct authority to do anything. And our focus has been, so it's very much about finding those points where working at a partnership level can add value to that local level. And what we found is that through discussion with the partnership, at the moment, we're focusing very strongly on 3-4 principles going forward. We're very much trying to support much better tackling of equity and diversity. So removing barriers for everyone to have access to benefits, and also having a much more diverse sector and much more diverse volunteer and community stewardship schemes. Supporting all the efforts on resilience of the urban forest itself, and of London as a whole, as a result of having a resilient urban forest. It makes no sense for each borough to go and do some research about which species they should plant, what's the best management regime. So those kind of things, it really makes sense to pull together and do it at a pan-London level. Especially, we have Cooke Botanical Garden in the partnership, fantastic players to interact with. So, and then the third theme is around collaboration, and again, it's about enhancing our individual partners' ability to work with a professional and organization outside the tree world, but also to collaborate on cross-boundary projects. And fourth theme is around capacity, around skills. So the benefit of having this regional approach, supporting capacity building and coordination, I think it definitely gives the sector, the urban forestry and urban and community forestry sector, a bigger voice. Because then when we have things like the either grant programs that might external funding opportunities, we can say, well, we know what we want to do, and we have a partnership, and we have the ability to deliver together, and we can apply for funding together. But also when there are some spatial priorities, and we might discuss this later, but we can also say, oh, there's a aspiration to deliver this big green corridor here. Trees are an element of it. We're going to pull the weight of our partnership behind that and make the tree element happen. So we're going to look at all the delivery pathways because we have the ability to work that out. Individually, it would be very difficult for each borough to start pulling on those elements. And so I think that's really a real that bigger weight and the ability to punch above one's individual weight is really important. And the other element is, I think, this partnership-based approach, because in a way we're a non-statutory partnership, and we also have a lot of flexibility, and that's wonderful. The challenge, it's the other side of the coin. It's that perhaps we're a coalition of the willing. So interpersonal relationships are paramount. Trust building is paramount. And many of the organizations who are in the partnership will compete sometimes for the same resources. Now, if we think even in terms of approaching us, the GLA, as a funder, but also other. So we have to be within the partnership very clear on identifying where partnering adds value and really focusing, being laser focused on that, because otherwise it doesn't work.
That's really, really insightful thoughts on the power of partnership there. We wanted to move on to thinking about another of the themes that Simon and Adam were just talking about, around how do you use that data, social data, environmental data, spatial evidence to kind of inform the development of the plan, and to I suppose actually thinking about the partnership piece for partners to coalesce around. Could you talk a little bit about how that's happening with the London Urban Forest Plan?
Yes, absolutely. And that's, I think, also something where I think while we're using and planning to use data, we're using it in very different ways from the way Simon has gone about it, where to a degree there has been a big data gathering exercise to inform the master plan. This hasn't been the case in London, and right now we're finalizing an update of the London Urban Forest Plan, and again we have gathered no evidence other than the qualitative evidence that I could get with engaging with the Urban Forest Partnership. But while we're working, there's our two big processes going on. One, there's the London local nature recovery strategy that's being developed, and from a ecological or nature recovery perspective, it's obviously the evidence base that London will have. And then alongside of this, London has had for some while the All London Green Grid for now a number of years. It's a spatial framework for green infrastructure across London, and that is being updated, and it will be published next year under the name of the London Green Infrastructure Framework. And it's a bit different than just a spatial framework. It's fundamentally, it's an online interactive evidence base with imaging layers, with plenty of maps, like an urban heat, and very much along the lines of what Simon was describing. And then an assessment of needs, but not just related to trees, green space, the whole green infrastructure and access, quality. And then alongside of that online evidence base will be some key spatial priorities. So the way, especially this update we're developing now, is that the London Urban Forest Plan does not have a spatial dimension, but the premise is to prioritize needs for wildlife, needs for resilience, or need for people, especially from a public health or access perspective. And so any actions that supports, for instance, efforts to enhance management or to promote expansion, they're always articulated in terms of focusing on the areas of greatest needs. And then we defer to the evidence base that's being developed through the statutory processes, the LNRS on the one hand and the London Green Infrastructure for the other. And all our actions are about, yes, we will invest, for instance, in terms of identifying or prioritizing areas for woodland creation on the priority areas identified in one or the other, whatever is relevant. We will review the findings from the London Green Infrastructure Framework, and in terms of key green corridors, for instance, and take forward the tree element for that. So we rely on existing evidence bases, for spatializing our intervention. And as I already mentioned, this idea of equity is sort of a fundamental principle that underpins sort of everything we're trying to do. So rather than producing our own or commissioning our own, we've tried very much to, and the timing has very much helped to align ourselves to a very big evidence gathering exercise that we're going on, and then positioning the partnership and the Urban Forest Plan as then a delivery mechanisms for the ambitions highlighted in those plans for the three elements.
Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful. And it's always really, I suppose, both a relief, but really important for me, and like the work we've just heard from in Birmingham and Belfast, that London is also putting equity at the front and centre of the kind of plan making, the improvement, the delivery, because that's such an important outcome for the Urban Forest Accelerator, but just generally. So just we've got one final question, and a couple of minutes left. The London Urban Forest Plan was first published a few years ago, in 2020. You're currently reviewing and refreshing it. Are there any big changes that you're expecting to see this time round? And what's the benefits of this iterative approach, where you kind of, rather than having it and keeping it for the next 10, 20 years, but sort of taking it in slightly shorter chunks and refreshing it, do you think?
Are there big changes? No, we're working within the existing structure. So we haven't spent time in terms of trying to reinvent a structure, or we've worked with the London Urban Forest Plan. Has had 3 themes: protect and manage, grow and expand, promote and support, and 12 goals supporting that. And we've kept that structure, and we're updating the actions that support the delivery of each of those goals. We've looked at really a very sort of narrow, you could say, focus on one side. But what we've done, and that's where the value of an iterative process, I think, come to light, is that we've learned from the work we've done in the past 5 years about really pinpointing where partnership working adds value. And that's how we came up with this idea of having 4 themes: the equity, resilience, collaboration, that is really as principles underpins how we've thought about delivering of these 3 themes, and also goals that are very much, you could say, things that you expect from a technical perspective, from an urban forestry perspective. Like, okay, but how are we going to go about this, and what do we need to focus on at a partnership level? And that's, I think, the plan has been maturing from that perspective, in that I think there's much greater clarity as to where the partnership can really add value, and how do we work on those themes and goals. And I think that has evolved. And it builds upon the relationship that have been established, the trust, the maturity through learning by doing. And I think having time, if one really wants to tackle this issue of equity on the one side and diversity on the other, which they're different, but they're really connected, it takes real time. And if you don't give yourself that time, then I think results are very hard to come by. And I think there were some elements of always in the initial plan about prioritizing areas of low canopy covers, or prioritizing in other goals like less diverse. Yeah, there was some elements of it, but it hadn't built on a very systematic level as we've done now. And especially from an equity and access to the tree benefits, there's so much work to be done there that one definitely needs an iterative process to be able to progress there.
Thank you. It's really helpful, and to hear and to see so clearly how London's approaching it, and how others could do too. Just by way of wrap up, when do you expect, if you have got a date in mind, that the plan will be published?
Yes, we're launching on the 7th of February.
Marvellous. Thank you very much, Anne. I'll hand back to David now.
Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you, Anne and Victoria, and to Simon and Adam as well. Yes, I think a really important and often overlooked part of trying to achieve healthier urban forests, to think about all of that stuff. And I think through both of those, what came out really strongly was the importance of an evidence base as a prerequisite for effective action, and then also how important partnership is for adding value and actually getting that stuff done. So we're moving to a short 10-minute break. So stretch your legs, get some coffee, get whatever you need. You can see on the slide here some instructions about how to use the Miro board. So it'd be really great if you have the time, besides your coffee and your leg stretch, to have a look around there, fill in some of the questions, or just explore the link to the toolkit, which I think is in the chat and should be fairly prominent within that Notion page as well. So we'll be back at 2:15 for the session on community engagement and equity. Thanks.
Hi everybody, welcome back. Thanks for posting your questions and comments in the chat and Q&A. I think that speaks volumes about the fact that there's a lot more of this work to explore, the complicated things, and yeah, we're looking forward to delving into some, using the resources in different ways over the next sort of couple of years, and getting to grips with some of these issues. We're now going to have a section of the event that focuses on an area that throughout the project has felt like it's really tied everything together. And it's this idea of how do we engage communities and residents to meaningfully involve them in increasing tree equity, and crucially in ways that are relevant to them. So we all know about the benefits of trees and the merits of increased canopy cover in the right place. And we also know that there's an inequitable distribution of this canopy cover, especially in densely populated urban centres. So to maximise the social, emotional and health benefits of trees, we need to explore the range of ways people understand and interact with them. So, you know, trees and forests are the source of some of our oldest stories and myths, from yew trees that predate our churchyards to protests about the felling of individual trees or whole treescapes. They're a really important part of our cultural heritage. And the meanings and understandings of trees are really deep and diverse. So how can we bring these diverse voices into our work? How might the principles of equity give us an organising framework? Can we offer people the opportunity to shape public places in their towns and cities with more direct agency? These are the sort of questions we've been looking at throughout the project and only just really starting to scratch the surface of. And finally, as data-driven tools become more sophisticated and freely available, how do we avoid top-down decision-making that alienates people in communities? Dark Matter Labs have written a brilliant report as part of this toolkit on how to work with data and communities to deliver not just distributional, but also procedural equity. And it's that procedural equity. In other words, how do we involve people in a fairer way in decision-making that we're going to have a look at now. So there will be a short Q&A for 10 minutes at the end of this session. And I'm really excited to introduce this really wonderful panel of people who are working really in depth in communities and with people to plant trees in their areas. And we're going to have, the chair for this session is Jess Thompson, who is CEO of City of Trees, which is the community forest for Greater Manchester.
Thanks, Emily. Can you hear me okay? Am I in and on? Excellent stuff. Well, hello and welcome everybody to the next session. As Emily has already said, this is all about tree equity and community engagement. And of course, when we talk about tree equity, we're talking about an equitable mass of trees across our landscape, but actually it's the other dimension, is it? It's the how do we form an equitable approach to community engagement. So at City of Trees, we have 3 core aims, which is to plant trees, to look after trees, and to nurture a tree and woodland culture. And at the heart of all of those things is people. And we look at ways of how we can involve people as much as possible in that process. And so that's, in a nutshell, we are going to be joined here today by a lovely panel. We have Katy, Beth and Charles, and they're going to introduce themselves in a moment. But yeah, we'll be looking at, you know, the art form that is engaging communities in our urban forest. And I say it's an art form because it is a challenge. There's loads of opportunity, which is really exciting, but we all know, those that have undertaken community engagement, it is challenging, and there's lots and lots of different methods and techniques and pathways by which people can join in and participate and really shape their environment, which is what makes this kind of, I think, this phenomenon just really special, in that, you know, people do genuinely, truly get to shape the environment and their neighbourhood that they live. So we're going to be talking about that in this next session, and we'll be covering off the good, the bad and the ugly. We have a few points that we're going to talk around, but the conversation is very loose, and as Emily said, there'll be opportunity for questions and answers at the end to be addressed. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Katy. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, yep, my name's Katy Hawkins. I work with Birmingham Tree People as community lead, and I was working on the Urban Forest Accelerator programme last year with Birmingham as the case study. So I was working in 3 neighbourhoods of low tree equity and working to involve people. Well, we were aiming to involve people in all stages of tree establishment, deciding what we planted, where and how, and also approaches to aftercare. And the ethos was very much around starting with existing connections to trees and the existing ways people connect and appreciate them, and building from that point onwards. And yeah, I'd say we were sort of using co-production type methods, community organising, asset-based community development. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Katy. Charles, can I pass over to you now for an introduction?
Hello, everyone. Very nice to be here. I'm standing on Barnes Common, according to my photograph, but I'm actually at the University of Hertfordshire. So, but I'm an architect. I'm a partner at JTP. We are what we call collaborative placemakers. We work with communities and stakeholders to develop visions and develop plans and strategies for places. We work at the scale of individual buildings right up to new settlements. We work a lot in urban centres, and we also work in creating new garden communities and edge of town settlements. So a whole range of different co-design processes that we run, and also focusing a lot more now on governance and stewardship, which obviously is an incredibly important part of delivering trees and landscape in general.
Thank you, Charles. Beth, over to you.
Hi, glad to be here talking about these really important issues with you. My name is Beth Collier. I'm director of Wild in the City. Wild in the City helps people of colour find our place in the UK countryside and nurture a relationship with the natural world. And our main focus is to help people connect with nature on their doorstep through a programme that includes natural history, but also practical traditional skills for being comfortable in the outdoors for longer periods of time. And we also train people of colour as leaders in nature through a nature guide programme, an in-depth year-long training. Thank you.
Splendid. Look forward to hearing more about that in due course. So I thought we'd start us off with talking about a piece of work that you're either involved in at the moment or have been involved in, that has gone particularly well from a community engagement perspective. Charles, are you okay to kick us off?
Yes. Okay. I was thinking about one thing, but I might mention that in a bit. But the thing I was going to talk about is something I've been involved with my local community. I mean, it is sort of parallels with work I do professionally as well. But I just sort of got involved with my local community, and we ran a charrette process, a co-design process to look at the whole of Barnes Village, the housing areas, and also Barnes Common, which is quite a large area managed by the Barnes Common Group, which is a community interest company. And as a result of that visioning and having that integrated approach, thinking about the community, the place, the businesses, the environment, there's a town team that's established, which has 6 action teams now. There's a very clear vision for the whole village on the river. But also one of the town teams is called Green Barnes, and it's connected with the Barnes Common Group, and is really sort of motoring away, thinking about the management of the place, how it integrates with the common, with the green spaces in the local area, and how the community are fully involved and engaged in terms of keeping sustainable sort of management of the place, looking at resilience. There's a community bluescapes program, and of course tree planting as part of that. So it's really an integrated and holistic sort of approach which fits in to the place as well as focusing on the environmental and tree aspects. So that was the thing I wanted to mention, and it's amazing the sort of the engagement across the community and across all age groups that's done through a structured organisation as well.
And how was it being on the other side? Actually,
well, it's a very. I'd recommend it. Yes, I would definitely recommend it. It's very, very good to see what the reality is and what the frustrations are, but also what the benefits are. And it's something that I would heartily recommend.
Yeah, great stuff. Thank you for sharing that, Charles. Beth, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, we've been really proud to be involved in work alongside the Woodland Trust in bringing the tree equity tool to the UK and looking at its suitability for the UK context. The work's been led by Woodland Trust and American Forests, but we gave some consultation around the relationship between ethnicity and race. Obviously, in the US context, there's a long history of the civil rights movement and environmental justice movement sort of moving alongside each other. So much greater understanding of how disparities have developed and the impact they have. So whereas in the US, practices like redlining, which denied mortgage access to Black people, led to a very clear geographic segregation, where the statistics are quite stark. We can clearly say there's a 38% difference in tree canopy cover for Black people in the States. The history of segregation, if you like, here in the UK has been slightly different, and the research literature is virtually non-existent in the UK looking at that relationship. So it's been very exciting to start that process of undertaking some peer-reviewed research, which is underway at the moment alongside the University of Exeter and Dr. Ben Wheat, to really interrogate what is the relationship between ethnicity and other protected characteristics in the UK, which we're very excited about, that potential to help communities advocate for themselves and for organisations to better target areas with disadvantaged groups.
Brilliant. And it's always good to have that kind of research completely embedded in practice, I think.
Yes. And because better at factoring in the impact on marginalised groups right at the beginning of programmes. So it's an evidence-based tool that we can use.
Great. And what's the time frame on that work? Do you know when we might see an outcome?
Yes, so the research is coming to its sort of final drafts, and wanted to be submitted to a journal, so that process is less certain in terms of the time length. But yes, hopefully we should have some concrete data soon to share.
I look forward to that. And yes, about time. There's definitely absolute dearth of research in that area. So splendid. Thanks very much, Beth. Katy, would you like to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about a few moments relating to the planting we did last year through the UFA. I was thinking that some of the best moments for me have been when there's been a sense of kind of intimacy and depth. As I mentioned, we tried to work with people, whether it be individual residents, community groups, organisations, to be involved at all stages of tree establishment. It was quite a short time frame though, so like we managed to do bits of that to varying levels of depth, but for me it was great when it did feel we reached that. Like some standout moments were being in a community leaders lounge where we were all discussing after a mindful tree walk what tree we'd like to welcome into the neighbourhood, and it was a really conversational decision-making process, and kind of through consensus decided we want to welcome some sweet gums, and yeah, I would have loved to have the opportunity to do more of that. We're involving people elsewhere through like postal votes or a consultation or different kind of methods, but I really like the conversational aspect. I think like moments of spontaneity that sprung from the process as well. Lots of people deciding they wanted to name the tree or sign the stakes with their names, and just different little moments that sprung out of the process. And for me, what I think is important is like, and what underpins all of this is creating spaces to explore and nurture our relationship to trees. And a lot of the stuff we did after the planting focused on that, and worked with a lot of artists, including I brought in an improvisation practitioner to work with some school groups, and she did such exciting work getting the kids to kind of empathize with the tree and the tree's journey, the ones who are planting, and think about their journey from the nursery, growing up, and they're all like acting out being in the van, trundling along, and then being plonked in this new bit of earth, and suddenly having all these people clapping around it. And it was really exciting to kind of get the children through their bodies to act out like the tree's journey, and to maybe build a bit of empathy. And the school have gone on to adopt the trees, and that kind of came out of that session. So moments of kind of intimacy, spontaneity, and spaces for these relationships to grow in particular ways were exciting for me.
That's lovely. And I love the idea of kind of exploring people's personal stories with trees. So a number of years ago, we ran a project called Heritage Trees, and I was absolutely flabbergasted that, you know, when we went out and we spoke to sort of individuals and community groups, many of which were, I wouldn't put them in the self-selecting camp. You know, we'd gone out and done quite a good bit of outreach to try and sort of reach people who may be more disengaged. And it was very interesting that everybody from all walks of life, whether they were brought up in Manchester or the UK or abroad, did have some form of anecdote or story that they had about a tree, even if it was just something that they remembered in their nan's garden or something. And it's just it's really special, I think. And perhaps we used to say it's because they're so majestic, the trees, but you know, compared to, I don't know. Very interesting stuff though. Thank you very much. So I thought we'd move on to thinking about, you know, there's lots of approaches and techniques and principles of ways of working with community groups and individuals. And I just wondered whether we could move on to that. And does anybody have any kind of approaches that they would like to share?
Well, I can follow on from what you were just saying, the importance of the emotional connection.
Yes, please, yeah.
The power of that in building communities. So Wild in the City is a therapeutically grounded organisation. All of our senior nature guides are also nature-allied psychotherapists. So we help people reflect on and explore their emotional relationship to the natural world. So a lot of our work around community engagement, for example, in connection to trees, is often under the canopy of trees, around the fire, holding a reflective space to explore what was our relationship growing up and what is it now. And just as you were mentioning, the depth of story and emotion that comes from that, we work with a group of people who often feel marginalised, that they don't belong or that they're not welcome in nature and natural settings. And when we reflect on nature, it's clear how deep the emotional connection is to the natural world, or their memories of back home if they weren't born here. And I think sometimes we have to remember that the issue isn't always a separation from nature, but relationships with other humans that make us feel nature isn't ours or for us, and that there's a difference there. But that the power of reflecting, having conversation with others, in evoking memory, and through that, stepping into feeling that sense of belonging in nature, in the natural world. And a lot of people that I work with, people of colour, feel that they're on the outside of tree planting of nature. They'd love to be more deeply involved, but feel that they're consulted, or they find out about the project when the tree is in the ground and it's sort of time for watering, that sort of level. So I think there's something about understanding this desire from most groups of people to take care of nature and to be involved right from the beginning. And I think, as Katy shared as well, that intimate personal, emotional relationship is one of the best ways to not evoke the interest is always there, but evoke the permission, the welcome to be involved in this kind of work.
Do you, we were involved with some work with the University of Salford, and we conducted some interviews, and we found that actually for some people they have to almost give themselves permission to appreciate nature. Have you found that has anybody else found that in the work that they've done, that there's this kind of almost sometimes a sort of passing over of permission to allow yourself to enjoy that kind of therapeutic nature of our natural world?
Absolutely, from our community members. And when it comes to tree planting, that extends into a question of am I allowed? This lack of understanding about whose responsibility it is, which can lead into a passivity of it's for someone else to do. That route into how accessible it is to decide you'd like some trees on your street and to take action. It always doesn't feel to people it's in the realm of possible.
Yeah, interesting. Katy or Charles, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, could go back to the question about different approaches to practice. Is that I was reflecting in advance, and definitely involving people as early as possible. I think ideally people should step forward and be given the space to ask for this to happen rather than for us to decide. And I think if that's not happening, then we need to be involving communities at the very, very, very beginning and rewriting briefs or rewriting approaches with people. And I think trying to spend as much time in the neighbourhood as possible is so important. And if you can hot desk from there, or just find ways to be there as much as possible, even just passive time. And I think a commitment to journeying together alongside people throughout, and always giving the opportunity to be involved, even if people don't have the capacity, but just to invite that. And I think the most important one is just asking and trusting that people know who live in their neighbourhoods. They know, and they know other initiatives that are going on that this could link up to, and we'll have those smart embedded solutions. So I think it's trusting and asking. And the trees can be so many things. They can answer to so many different issues or aspirations in areas like improving streets or mental health or supporting creativity or to bring communities together. So kind of trying to find that overlap space and go from there. But I think it's really important to give space for people to step forward and say, we want this and this is how we want it to happen, rather than going in without that.
One of the things I've sort of noticed over the years of doing and thinking about community engagement is actually, I feel that, we have to make activities meaningful to people, don't we? So if you are, we've done a lot of work, we've done a lot of work on, estates that are real sort of in areas of real high levels of deprivation. And when we've thought about kind of engagement models, we've gone through a whole thing around, do we want to set up a friends of group? And that's the sort of approach that we used to do more of. But I feel as though we've moved on from that a little bit more to kind of understanding the ways in which our kind of urban forest and green infrastructure can play a role for people in their lives. So it may well be when we come to things like encouraging people to help water and maintain the trees. Is that some good work experience for somebody that's out of work, for example? And you know, just to kind of try and extend the meaningfulness beyond that kind of innate feeling that we have to have nature in our lives. Does that make sense? Charles, is that something that you've noticed in relation to discussions that you've had around maintenance? Do you have a kind of a preferred approach, or?
Well, I you know, just again in answer to the original question quickly, just, you know, it's really trying to engage people at the earliest possible process time, but also engage people in designing the process, if you like, so that people do feel that it's for them. Not that it's sort of, this is going to happen, come along to this or be part of this. It's actually, you know, shaping it in a way that people have a role in that shaping of it. And then, you know, we often talk about, we use the term charrette for the work, you know, workshops, whatever. There's the pre-workshop phase, the workshop itself, and of course workshops can be many different things, but there's that sort of co-creation time, and then there's what happens afterwards. And your question really about stewardship, management, etc., absolutely is critical. And I think we're even now more and more bringing that right to the front. So as well as deciding what it is you want to do, it's how are you going to manage it, who's involved in that, and again, that's really critical to engaging the whole breadth of the community, all backgrounds, all age groups. And one of the projects we're working on at the moment, which is really exciting, is a relatively small development of around 150 homes, but it's right next to a secondary school where it's going to have what we're terming a farmstead, which will be about 3 or 4 acres of land, which will actually provide therapeutic services to the school, which is noticing, you know, a big increase, like many parts of the country, of non-attendance or children having various mental health issues that they're dealing with. And so providing this new facility right next door, which would be managed by a local rural trust, which has other centres around the county, and then take that out into the development itself as well. So this whole stewardship will go from the farmstead and into the streets and places of the development too. So there's a sort of holistic view of everything. And I think, you know, trees, in terms of a community, you know, I'm sure there are projects where it's about trees only, but I think for me, as an architect and a placemaker, it's a combination of trees and other environmental services, environmental goods. And what's right in one place may not be right in the other. I mentioned Barnes Common. There's quite an area of acid grassland, so actually they're trying to reduce the tree cover in that case, but still there are plenty of trees. And in the high street, it's not appropriate really to have trees the way it's set up, but there are trees at each end, etc. So it's being able to have that conversation in the round with people about their place, about what's relevant to their lives, and help people to shape the process, as well as then what comes out at the end of it in terms of how the place is managed and what the community's role is.
Great, thank you. And I was going to move us on now to talk about the sort of trickier side of community engagement. And, you know, we've all been in situations where you think, I'll never do that again. I've learned loads from that. So does anybody want to share? Because this is about the good, the bad and the ugly, isn't it? This is what we're getting underneath the skin of, is what we feel as though is really does work. And if anybody has any pointers as to kind of, you know, stuff they tried, it didn't quite work out so well. Anybody?
Everything's been perfect. So sorry, should I say something?
Yes, please do.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, as I mentioned about the beginning about being involved as a member of the community, as well as being a professional in this world as well. It's, you know, often I think one of the things I always see is local authorities, particularly the people who are elected, who have a key role in a community and our representatives. Yeah. Sometimes not being able to give up that control a little bit, or you get a change of administration. So there's the political cycles thing, I suppose, for me, which can disrupt things. if you and also in my world, you know, I have often public sector clients, but also private sector who are developers. So sometimes the certainty and knowing that you can see something through is a challenge. And the worst thing is when I mean, I've had a project recently which has kind of stopped, and obviously viability is a big issue in the built environment world at the moment. So starting people along a journey and then sort of it stops. So we always really want to have some kind of end point that is a result of the process. You know, here we've achieved this. This is what was the result of your involvement. So yeah, it's that sort of uncertainty, things stopping and starting, political cycles.
Yeah. Yes, it
I'd
is
echo
tricky.
what Charles is saying about viability.
Yeah.
We're all struggling for funding and certainty at the moment.
Yeah.
I think particularly as an organisation focused on people of colour and the environmental sector saying, why aren't people of colour more involved? It's a particular frustration for us that lack of access to funds and other resources stops us doing the work. It's not so much a challenge for us in connecting the community. I think we do that very well. We've gained permissions to manage some woodlands, urban woodlands, very special habitats because they have a historic connection to people of colour. There's a story to be told about those woodlands, but we just haven't been able to get the funds in to be able to activate the management plan that's already been written. So I think there are a lot of stories amongst organisations like mine, because I know we're not the only ones, where you're not seeing our tree planting and our work in urban forestry because you don't make it across the starting line to get the funds to activate. I think that's an important story to highlight, particularly when people are saying we want things to be more diverse. There's a question mark about why some organisations can't get traction, but understanding working in a context where we're all struggling to bring in funding.
Yeah, absolutely. Good points, well made. Katy, do you have anything?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to talk around a few points. I think when time is so restricted, there's a question of like, if you can't do something well, is it better just not to do it at all with community involvement? And yeah, I think sometimes not having enough time, I wish we'd just not done it. And it's better. Yeah, so that's one thing, just questioning whether you have enough time to do it well, and if not, is it actually you're contributing to like maybe consultation fatigue or various other different things if it goes wrong, or not as well as it could rather. I generally think that a lot of pressure or we are really reliant on those embedded community organisations to support generously, and you know, you try and make the project of mutual benefit for them, but nonetheless they do give a lot, and hopefully you give a lot too, but I'm just conscious that often they are under-resourced and you're coming in and working with them and their pre-existing like networks of trust in the community that then you can reach into. But yeah, just about the kind of generosity of them that is given, and like making sure that that's properly rewarded. Or yeah, and then also I think it can be tricky when sometimes the existing trees in neighbourhoods are not well cared for enough, or there is some levels of neglect due to like lack of budget and so on, and so it's tricky to be adding new trees when the existing ones are not doing well enough, or there's not enough demonstrable care for them. So just like the ethics around that, and whether it's always appropriate, and whether actually you should just be spending all your time on thinking about how you can better advocate for care, or support residents to complain better, or whatever it needs to be. So yeah, I think those are some of the things I think about.
We've got a question from the audience here. Does the panel have any tips to share on bringing community members on board that fundamentally don't like trees, especially street trees? Yes, so I think we probably all experienced the people that hate leaves, hate blossom, hate birds, all of that kind of, I'm sure over time you've had lots of responses to consultation. Do you, and it sort of brings me on to, do you think as part of your practice, do you talk about the wider benefits of trees to try and get over that kind of sense from people that they just don't want this in their neighbourhood or on their street? So, for example, think about the wider ecosystem services, all the other benefits that trees bring. I'm
And it's
thinking
interesting
about
with the-
flooding and all, you know, climate change, the whole gambit really. Come on, Beth.
there is that sort of educative approach of, as you say, sort of selling the benefits, sharing the benefits, but also what we would do would be really keen to understand why they hate blossom. Where does that come from? Why do they hate?
Yeah,
And just having the time and the space just to reflect on that, to consider that, but in a non-judgment way. It's just sort of sharing your story about how you feel about trees.
yeah,
And often that can be enough to give space to things to be aired.
Yeah.
And in hearing other people talk about what they perhaps enjoy or their relationship might shift something. So for us, we take sort of a therapeutic approach to understanding without seeking to need to change. But often if people have a strong objection, there could be an emotional connection somewhere that needs to be vented or shared.
yeah. So you're kind of going straight in there for kind of unearthing what it is and people's emotions around there. That's a good approach.
Because of the way we work, that's how it
Yeah.
would come out.
Yes. Katy, Charles, have you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, the way we work, I suppose, there's a therapeutic element, although we're not trained, but we've always thought of ourselves a little bit in that way. But it's so that people can talk about their place and what the issues are, etc. And I suppose again, the sort of the placemaking angle is a broad sort of integrated approach. So would maybe just not focus on trees only. It would be about the place generally, and there may be things that could go in place of trees, or the trees might go somewhere, or people see the holistic rationale behind why things might go where, and it's not just one thing, it's a range of things. And also the fact that people hear other people's views and stories too. So that you're developing a consensus, and then people, in my experience, appreciate that they don't get everything that they personally want themselves. It's about a kind of shared view, and going on the journey together and developing a vision together that helps then people to understand. So, it may be not diversionary as such, but there may be other things too that people can start to get interested in, rather than focusing on a negative, start to focus on positive. So that's I suppose our approach is to develop a sort of consensus vision and get people talking and sharing amongst themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say over the last 20 years, I've seen a kind of a step change in our approach to kind of really broaden the conversation around the wider benefits of trees. So you're talking about taking a holistic view to the neighbourhood. Often, you get to the root of the problem, and it might be about parking, or people leaving the bins out, or
it's always about parking.
Always about parking, yeah. And so we've sort of taken a more in our consultation had a sort of campaign side to the consultation. So we're kind of introducing, this is an amazing thing that's happening in your neighborhood because of all of these other benefits. And I just wanted to bring us onto the sort of different platforms. So we are in a digital era now, and we've sort of started to incorporate some digital, I suppose, methods of engagement. Has anybody else done anything similar or have anything to share? How do you use social media at all? Which I know can be a double-edged sword, but
yeah, I mean, we in terms of planning our processes and working towards an event, a co-design event, or events, we will use digital media. We're making more videos now. We're trying to engage younger people in doing that in our offices, etc. Reflecting all backgrounds, and really sort of trying to make things fun, but also give people access to engagement online. But I think there's a recognition that in person is also very important. So whilst you can you can kind of get information and people's thoughts, good, bad, whatever, online. You might have online map-based platforms, etc., and you can develop a bit of a dialogue. in our experience, and I'd be interested to hear other people's views, but it's when you come together in around a plan, or in a room, and you have those face-to-face conversations and start to co-design. That's when you kind of make the leaps forward, if you like, and start to develop consensus. So whilst there's digital, and it's very helpful, and we're in a digital age, also the human relationship elements are really key, and I think that's also between professional and community. So but also recognizing a key part of our sort of approach obviously is the expertise within the communities, and the creativity and knowledge that communities have, that can be brought to the process, the co-design processes.
Thank you, Charles. Beth?
Yeah, for us, our ethos is very much about nurturing healthy environments, and we've always struggled to reconcile that with online and social media. So yes, it's a great way of reaching a larger number of people, but like Charles, for us it's about in person, in relationship with nature, so usually meeting in a natural setting, and for us that usually means around the fire. But we do make use of Zoom and WhatsApp for smaller online communities.
Yeah. Katy?
Yeah, similar, very analog based approaches, I'd say, and from door knocking, but in terms of the engagement, so maybe door knocking as well as all the other flyering and so on. But being there in person, building those relationships has been the most important element. So we use social media to promote, but I think working at a really hyper-local neighbourhood scale, it's just more about being there, being present, and
Could I just add that once you've made those relationships and created a vision as such, and everyone knows where you're heading, and not to say there aren't sort of detailed changes to be made, but once you've got the broad brush sort of consensus, we do find then that the online can be quite helpful in holding sort of further meetings, again not solely, but for example, if you're developing a document and you've got a smaller group, it can be very effective to have online meetings where you can review a document, send it out in advance, but you can talk and have those sorts of meetings. So sometimes there are benefits, but I think that whole getting to know people face to face, building those relationships, I think is really important, and you can't really do it genuinely, in my view, without that.
I agree. I think in terms of building those relationships in person is always the way to go, and I think we know that instinctively anyway, don't we? And just as it's been said through our work, I will fly the flag for digital in some respects though. So what we found is that not everybody will want to go to those meetings, but people will have an opinion about what's happening. And so the meetings aren't always for everybody. So we've used this tool called Forest Plans, which basically it's a QR code on a site that we're going to, planting some trees on, for example. And it's there, people are taken to a dedicated site that gives them all of the information about the site and why we're doing it and what the benefits will be. And people can write comments, and one way it was quite good because you can field off, you can look at negative comments, but actually our staff are not having to deal with that face to face, because that's actually really stressful if you're doing that all of the time, day to day. But also that people leave really positive comments, and those are the things that often isn't shared. So we found it as a way, as a sort of platform that you do get a balance of mix. And I think when people can see that, it's just then it I don't know, I think it in some way it must kind of shape people's perspectives a little bit more, that actually some people around here would really like to have some trees here. Perhaps it's just me. So I think there is I think there's space for all sorts of ways and techniques, aren't there, as appropriate, obviously, and it depending on your kind of the core work of your organization and your purpose and so on and so forth. That's really interesting stuff. I don't think that we have any other Q&As that have come through. I'm just going to check. I think that's it now. So I know, Beth, you mentioned funding. Yes. funding, the holy grail that we're all looking for funding, and our next session is all about funding. So I will be passing back over to Emily, I think. But thank you very much, everybody. It's been really interesting hearing your different perspectives and ways and means. And yes, and we must keep in touch. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. There is actually one question in the chat.
Oh,
If
right.
they've all gone. I'm going to try and hold them for a second. It may have come in after you saw it, Jess, but maybe I can just ask it. It's quite long though. So in understanding why the why about why people don't like things, how much of the work is about the environmental sector getting more comfortable with non-ecological matters and properly considering social, cultural and economic matters in project design, and how much of a shift is needed for this, for us to move away from an often misanthropic, ecologically purist view to one which is much more human and community centered. There's a lot there if anyone wants to try and tackle it.
I mean, I speak just really to agree, and I think it probably also links to why we struggle to get funding, although we are very much a natural history organisation as well, involved with rewilding and conservation. But I think the perception that our projects are mainly social justice or social issues driven has made us less attractive in terms of trying to attract funds. I think there's a lack of vision in seeing that the two go very much together. It's not either or. And that sometimes the waiting around looking at social disadvantage is important to achieve the overall aims of looking after a biodiverse habitat. I think there is more to be done in looking at the sort of institutions and infrastructure of why it's hard for some community organisations to get traction into doing this work. I think the thing we're calling out for, a more diverse group of people wanting to participate, is probably there in a lot of regions, but not able to convert that into putting a spade in the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're failing across a whole range of criteria, and I think in terms of designing places, whether they're rural or urban, we can do better, environmentally, socially, economically, by understanding and designing better, involving people in that to create better places. Because we've basically we've separated everything out, and we're creating, the unhappiest children in Europe. We're creating mental health problems. We're creating huge equity problems, and we just need to do better by integrating, having more integrated approach. I mean, I'm a very sort of green environmentalist, but I don't see that conflicting at all with creating great towns and cities. There's huge opportunity, to improve biodiversity and ecological gain across towns, cities, all sites that we work on, and to create much more socially equitable places, much more economically vibrant, very local economies. We just had to work at it, so it's a win-win-win as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to be said, isn't there, for kind of how we just mainstream a lot of this stuff around green infrastructure. And we have had some unfortunate kind of examples in Manchester where it's been, is this going to be a row of trees, or is it going to have a cycle infrastructure instead? And it's just about actually it can be both. And I think things like that, when the press pick up on the kind of a binary approach to our places and spaces is not helpful. Yes. Anyone else on that point? Katy, you got any points? No. Great. Are we at time, David?
I think we're very nearly at time. Yeah, you've done an exceptional job. So thank you all very much. Really appreciate it, and especially as we gave you all the challenge of bringing your work to life without the safety net of relying on slides. And it's been great. I feel like a really nice format and some excellent insight. So thank you all very much. We are now moving on to the final session of the day, and slightly cleverly, we've saved the conversation about money right to the end to try and keep everyone here. Obviously, a question on everyone's lips is this all sounds fantastic, but how are we going to pay for it? So it's clear there are huge, complex and competing financial pressures on local authorities, but there's also a convincing case for investment, one that we possibly need to better work out how to express. But at the end of the day, places simply need money to do this work. Private finance for green infrastructure is not going to be a panacea, but it can form part of a blended model together with income from diverse sources. What we heard repeatedly throughout this project was that funding for planting can be challenging, especially in hard landscapes where structural soils, crate systems, or other engineering are needed. But the difficulty in securing adequate revenue for maintenance long-term often eclipses that need or that difficulty in finding funding for planting. So this led us to think carefully about how payments for ecosystem services could be attracted in new scenarios in order to create sustainable revenue over time. Finance Earth, who we'll hear from today, have produced a comprehensive report on the current state of play, which is within the Urban Forest Accelerator Toolkit, which also explores potential areas for development in terms of creating tokens and urban greening codes to make sure that we can fund that greening in some of the hard landscapes that we really need to get to in the areas of low tree equity. But so whilst pursuing these sort of new exciting ventures is taking up a lot of focus, it's also important we think about that equity in funding, equitable funding. So there's no use promoting that equity on the one hand in our engagement work, as we've just heard about in detail, if we're sort of facilitating greenwashing behind the scenes with where our money is coming from. So it's essential we ask questions about where that money is coming from, and also where are the returns, financial and non-financial, going. So can we challenge ourselves to make sure residents and communities are always prime beneficiaries of investment? So without too much more of my abstract thoughts on the matter, over to people who really know what they're talking about. So firstly, Catherine Horan, the Director of Fundraising at Trees for Cities, who is going to introduce our panel. Thanks, Catherine.
Thanks, David. Good afternoon. So we've got a great panel today about my favorite subject, funding. It's not everyone's favorite subject, but it is mine. So we have Kat from Plymouth City Council, John from Treeconomics, and Elizabeth from Finance Earth. And we'll kick off with John on investment in urban forestry and building a case for it. John, you want to kick off?
Yeah. Hello, I'm John Rose. I work as an urban forest consultant for Treeconomics. We work with local authorities, developers, housing associations, communities across the country, anybody dealing with very large numbers of trees, and try to help them understand what they have today, what it's worth, and what they provide in environmental benefits, and then how to plan around that. Today, I'm going to talk about a piece of work that considered future scenarios for Birmingham's trees following the creation of their Urban Forest Master Plan, which was discussed at the top of the afternoon. So the first thing we looked at was business as usual. What happens if we just carry on what we've been doing? Next slide, please. So these are the headline figures. A loss of 230 hectares of tree canopy, or that's 0.8 percentage points reduction from current levels. They're worth about 20,000 fewer tons of carbon stored, potentially actually then released. A reduction in amenity value of over £1 billion. That's using CAVAT, Capital Asset Valuation for Amenity Trees. So I hope that link will get posted if you want to know more about that. This is on the back of losing some 65,000 trees. Now that's an average figure for all trees in all their different sizes across Birmingham, whether street trees, woodland trees, back garden trees. So those are headlines, but to make sense of them, we need a little context. So next slide, please. So on the left there, you have a map of Birmingham broken down by ward, showing the tree canopy cover in each case with a pretty large spread from single digits in the middle up to low 40s in the north. And on the right are the headline figures from this year's iTree Eco Sample Study valuing Birmingham's urban forest, which is a fairly major piece of work, surveyed 400 sites, each of about 400 square meters. And just to pick out a couple of points, 1.1 million trees, amenity value of £25 billion and £20 million of annual ecosystem services. So that's kind of where we start. That's today, if you will. So how do we go forward? Well, we built a very simple model. Kind of next slide, please. Okay, no hidden parts, no clever algorithms, no AI. It's built on a very simple idea that the net gain or loss of tree canopy is the aggregate consequence of the actions of policymakers, developers, utility companies, homeowners, workers, drivers, residents, all of us, everybody. And if we have a benchmark for the past and one for the present, and we carry on with the same actions, then a straight line forecast seems a reasonable approach to setting a base case for business as usual. You have to work with the data you can lay your hands on, and we had 2 points for Blue Sky National Tree Map, which were 6 years apart. They were both captured at the same time of year, same way, calculated with the same basic methodology. Now, the model is not so much a rock-solid forecast as a way to explore some ideas, some what-ifs. So, i.e., what if we just carried on? And at face value, as you can see on the right, my little picture, a loss of 4 percentage points of canopy cover, i.e., you could multiply all those figures I showed you just a couple of minutes ago by 5. Maybe a little too simple. So next slide, please. We then broke the city up into 345 units based on land use and ward. So the land uses you see on the left, roads includes pavements and verges. The rail network includes a 5-metre buffer either side of the tracks. Woodlands and open green space together. Urban, excluding roads, is all the buildings, hard surfaces and private gardens. Then everything else that's natural, mostly farmland, some water is in the other box. The wards you can see in the middle, same picture, all 69 of them. And we then ran a straight line forecast for each of those little blocks, projected it forward and added them all back up. And that generated the picture on the right, which gives us our loss of 0.8% canopy. The really interesting stuff is when you dig underneath. So next slide, please. The top band there is a split of land by land use, and the lower column charts changing canopy cover within each type of land use. So if you look closely, the roads drop by a percentage point, rails increase by a similar figure, but the latter cannot compensate for the former as it covers just so much less land, just 2% versus 17% taken up by the roads. Same happens with the next pairing. Woodlands move up by 4.5 points, whilst urban cover drops by 2.3 points. And look at the share of land. Woodlands occupies a fraction of the space that we give to buildings and urban spaces. Next slide, please. So the impact becomes more visible when you look across the wards. This shows ward level changes versus a starting point. So if 2022 is 100, index 100, then what's the movement from them? All the growth is in just a small proportion of the wards. Most wards go backwards. And they only look like that since they've been on that trajectory since 2016. Some do with a loss of over a quarter of their tree cover. So it's a pretty daunting prospect, and there's no getting away from the main impact. Next slide, please. So the city hollows out in tree terms. The grey gets greyer and the green gets greener. But it's not the only option. So we had a look at what we called arresting the decline. Next slide, please. So here we assumed that we could halt reduction in any of those units that were declining to their 2041 level and then hold them there. Anything that was growing would continue to do so. So 2041 is 10 years before the end of the Urban Forest Master Plan's timeline. The result is on the right. We still lose half the trees, 120 hectares of canopy, 10,000 plus 11,000 tonnes of carbon and £700 million in amenity value. Next slide, please. So if we run the same exercise but stop in 2031, then most of those losses are recoverable. Effectively, we stand still in overview, but still suffer some of the hollowing out. On the bright side, you can see how recent actions in the middle are starting to play out positively with that green stuff. Next slide, please. So when it comes to arresting the decline, speed matters. Slower intervention has a very costly impact. What about if we really went for it? Next slide, please. The other option was lifting all wards to 25% tree canopy cover. So where would that take us? It looks very good. All that green on the map, almost every ward growing. Next slide, please. And the result, 2,500 hectares of tree canopy cover, 219,000 tonnes of carbon, £13 billion pounds worth of amenity, and that's 680,000 extra trees by 2051, which all sounds very impressive, but it does leave a very big question. How do you do that? What would that take? So next slide, please. Back to our simple plan. We established costs for 3 types of planting in terms of what it would take to generate a hectare of canopy within the timescale required. Assume that this would be equivalent to planting all the trees at the halfway point in the plan, maintaining them to the end, i.e. they've all got 15 years maintenance and growth. This is based on a mix of published and data and industry experts. And on that basis, standard trees in pits, normal street tree, if you will, £450,000 a hectare. If you throw cells, rooting cells into the mix, then that jumps to 2.2 million. And if you come out and whips in soft landscapes, just £16,000. Pretty big variation. Next slide, please. We then applied a different mix for each of the 3 types of land use, generated cost for each type, and they range from £440,000 down to £16,000. If you take away the planting cost and just run the maintenance cost, you have a much smaller figure, which is the second figure for each land use. We use this figure to represent the costs associated with managing existing trees to maturity. The difference is stark. Next slide, please. So total cost to do that, we came up with £483 million to deliver £13 billion in tree amenity costs. An annual cost of £17 million across all landowners, which can be reduced significantly by including managing existing trees to maturity as part of the mix. Next slide, please. Right, so what about the mix? One final question. What if we change the mix to include different sized trees? For anything, we thought we needed to check where we were. Birmingham already has a heavy bias towards large growing species, with 70% of public trees and almost 80% of all trees. So the interesting bit is when you look at the cost. To generate the same canopy costs, at least treble if you use small trees versus the existing mix. Next slide, please. And so that was a very quick run through. These are the key takeaways. Business as usual means the grey gets greyer while the green gets greener. To be effective, our interventions need to be early and at scale. Managing existing trees to maturity is an important, cost-effective option. Finally, large trees are better value for canopy creation. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I'm going to hand over now to Elizabeth to go through developing models for income streams, kind of the next step from a case report.
Thank you, Catherine. And I'm Elizabeth Beall, one of the managing directors at Finance Earth. I'm really honored to join such a talented and inspiring group of presenters. And as John has just reminded us and done an excellent job of keeping time, speed matters. So I'm also going to whiz through some slides, but we're happy to answer any follow-up questions anyone has at the end or otherwise afterwards as well. So those of you that haven't met us yet, Finance Earth is a social enterprise founded about 8 years ago with the mission to mobilize private capital for nature, climate, and communities. And we're proud to call the National Trust as one of our longest standing partners. And we've also worked alongside a number of local authorities to develop climate and nature investment strategies, including Birmingham, Greater Manchester, West Midlands, Plymouth, among others. And our work on the Urban Forest Accelerator, as David said at the outset, has really been focused on building the business case for private investment in urban green space and developing the tools to support local authorities to mobilize more private capital. Next slide, please. And as we just heard from John, there are a range of options for where and what you plant and what that means for the types of benefits that are provided, but also the cost profile, as John just walked through. And I'm sure, those benefits that are provided are well known in this group, but can range from heat island reduction, carbon sequestration, biodiversity uplift, flood management, employee retention, property value increase, and many more. The problem has been that many, standardization of methodologies to quantify those benefits, but also attribution have been a challenge. Next, please. And historically, while those benefits may have been discussed as part of an overall narrative of tree planting interventions, they weren't the focus of what was being delivered. Previously, the focus may have been on the number of trees planted or the area covered, rather than on the flood risk reduction delivered, or the amount of savings that could deliver for a local authority, or particulate matter reduction, for example, and the health benefits associated with that. So while contributions were historically made based on the cost of delivering the project, and sometimes the maintenance, as John just talked through, that's a key element as well, that hasn't always been factored in upfront. And not all of the benefits or outcomes quantified and attributed to what was being done. So that's where we've focused on a kind of move towards an outcomes focus. Next slide, please. So by shifting to a focus on outcomes, there's potential to go beyond corporate social responsibility budgets and access greater sources of funding, which may be ring-fenced for risk reduction or regulatory compliance, and now can become available as we can show and make the case for the delivery of green infrastructure to address a range of environmental and social issues and provide a range of benefits. It also helps ensure that the right action is happening in the right place. So we just heard from John as well about a range of different types of trees, or types of options. So it's really important to consider that the type of tree or the type of urban green space being created is going to deliver the outcomes that are really needed in that place specifically, both social and environmental. And by that targeted approach, you can then also have a better ability to access willingness to pay for local stakeholders, which I'll go into now. Next slide. So through our work with the Urban Forest Accelerator, we've identified a range of outcomes that I've talked about, or ecosystem services, that we think a range of stakeholders would be interested in paying for. And we've had a number of meetings. Again, the logos that you see on screen are just illustrative, around interest in paying for these types of outcomes, and what they would need in terms of quantification and level of interest, demand from each of these stakeholders and sectors. So as you can see just from this example, some stakeholders might be more interested in certain outcomes. So for example, air pollution reduction might be of particular interest to healthcare or the insurance sector, whereas improved well-being might be of greater interest to employers or universities. So it's really important as well, as I said, when targeting those interventions and thinking about the associated outcomes, but then also as you start to engage with different stakeholders, and their willingness to pay will be improved by bundling those outcomes that are most of interest to them. Next slide, please. So we've talked about the who and the what they might be willing to pay for. I'm now going to shift to how to build an outcomes-focused investment case for urban green spaces. And this is a short amount of time, but as David said, there's a full report and as part of the toolkit that you can access after this webinar. So if you go to the next slide, please. One key part is really identifying what to plant and where, and then understanding what the costs are associated with a specific plan. And not just for the initial planting, but also for the maintenance, to give an accurate picture over time, and where there's any public funding that may be available, to look at then what is the gap that private funding needs to fill. And then to be able to look at, with that private funding gap, where you focus your efforts in terms of engagement with the various sectors that I mentioned in the previous slide. So just to zero in on one part of this journey, next slide, please. We've developed an urban tree cost modeling tool with support from Jaluzot to support local authorities in that specific element of the cost modeling, to really, as you can see, that's just a screenshot on the side of your screen to show the range of inputs that then local authorities have the ability to select what's most relevant for them, but also it serves as a reminder of the consideration of the various costs that should be taken into account, to be able to give a summary of exactly what those costs will be and the cash flow over time, in order to, again, get more specific in terms of the level of funding that needs to be accessed to support those costs. Next slide, please. I also just want to focus, as we talk about transitioning to an outcomes-focused model, it doesn't need to happen overnight. There's still a range of data challenges related with attribution of outcomes, in allocation of those outcomes when there's various stakeholders contributing or buying, wanting to report on different aspects. And so it's likely that it will need to be a gradual shift. So as outcomes and benefits are able to be quantified, so in some areas there's further science and data available. And then as those areas increase, obviously we can get to more of a verified, quantified approach under a code. So just one tool, next slide please, one tool that can support that transition is the idea of a token. So an urban tree token, for example, could cover a range of outcomes. And again, it could be bundled. So you could have, as I showed in the previous slides, you could have a health bundle or health token, or you could have a flood risk reduction token. And so there's a flexibility in this, but it's a way of giving a quantified, bundled set of outcomes that then buyers can pay for. And that can be a real tool in mobilizing more private finance for urban tree and urban green space development. Next slide, please. And this could eventually progress to an urban greening code, building off the learning from existing codes and standards that have largely been developed, focused on more rural environments like the Woodland Carbon Code, Peatland Code, and Biodiversity Net Gain. And so the idea with an urban greening code could be to build off that learning, but to really develop a code that is specific to urban green spaces and the quantification methodologies adapted and developed to really address urban spaces in particular. So we're excited to be working in this next phase with National Trust and Natural England to continue to support and ideally speed up and scale the mobilization of private capital for urban green spaces. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. All right, last but not least, Kat from Plymouth City Council on implementing models and what lessons can be applied.
Thank you so much. Just wait for those. It's always the worst slot to do the last one of the day. There's been so much covered already, but I will try and talk you through a slightly different angle in terms of what we're doing in Plymouth to actually fund that. So I think there's been some great speakers about the value of it, the value to communities, but ultimately we need some cash to make sure this happens. And I think the first lesson that we've learned is never do this on your own. Have lots of partners, have lots of friends. And so we've been working with the Urban Forest Accelerator to further our understanding of what we can do and really importantly, make sure we keep sharing that. Next slide, please. So we do have a good background in urban forestry, and I suspect this is the same for many urban environments. We've all now got our green infrastructure delivery plans. We've looked at canopy reports. We've looked at tree management principles, and ultimately this gives us a really good baseline on which to base our investment models. We have great credibility in these spaces as local authorities because we've done this for so long, and we are not for profit and we do things for people. So it puts us in a really unique and I think strong place when we're looking at new funding models. Next slide, please. So in Plymouth, we do have quite a good canopy cover, but it's very polarized in terms of, as you can see on the map, areas that really have a lot of trees, a lot of woodlands, street lined with trees, to the other side of the city where it is very grey, where we get some very low canopy data. And so, as with a lot of the talks today, that equity of delivery is as important as anything else. But as we've also heard today, delivering in those grey spaces are even more expensive. So that equity point drives with it a need to be even more creative with how we get our funding in. Next slide, please. So first thing, we have followed the advice of many people that have spoken today about make sure that we can value our urban forest. So we have done some work with Treeconomics and others to look at how much those trees do for our places. And that's a theme I want to come back to again and again. This is about trees for places. It's not trees for trees' sake. And I think the more we can embed all those benefits that trees deliver, again, the more creative we can be about where we get the funding to deliver our urban forests. And the other thing to note on this slide is the use of volunteers. And I think the one thing we also have to remember in this space, it's about resources, not always about cash, and how much those volunteers and community could do is absolutely fundamental. Next slide, please. So as we talked about, one of the challenges we have in Plymouth is we have a real inequity of where those trees are situated. As you can see, you know, canopy cover from 3%. You can just imagine how grey those wards are. And as you've guessed it, those are the areas with the greatest levels of deprivation and also health inequalities, to other parts of the city that are, you know, really beautiful, and you can see the benefits those deliver. And when we did some work on this to identify that, you know, 6,000 medium-sized trees would make a real difference, but those are the trees that would need to go in the hard landscape. They are not going to be cheap to deliver, but the benefits, if we can get them in, huge. Next slide, please. So we've been really fortunate in Plymouth, as well as our kind of heritage of having trees in our spaces. We've also recently had the opportunity to become one of the community forests. There are 15 in the country now, and it was a pleasure to join what was a already brilliant network, decades of experience of working with people and trees, and enabling us to take where we were with trees to another level as being part of that network. And you can see through the key aspects that we're trying to deliver around equality and inclusivity, resilience and pioneering, that they all fit with what we want to deliver in our urban environments, but also how we make those work in rural. So that's been a real step change for us in terms of how we deliver our urban forest and connect it with our rural. Next slide, please. So funding and finance, how do we get that money through the door? And I am going to say there is no silver bullet, and we haven't answered this question. We're still working on it, but we're working on it with a lot of people, and we want to share what we've learned, and we want to borrow from others. So you do need your delivery costs known, and we need them to be embedded, because what we know is people drive this work, and therefore we need to have sustained arrangements for them to be in post. We also need to be creative, so we're currently in Plymouth looking at how we bring all the tree stuff together, from the TPOs, the ARB teams, the community forest teams, the community delivery teams, and actually putting them together, and the strength of putting them together is really becoming apparent. It's always easier to fund projects externally, so kind of make sure you've got your pipeline ready and use that pipeline to drive those longer term revenue streams, and I'll come back to that. And obviously maintenance, as I'm sure many people in charge of trees in urban places across the country are finding, looking after our existing trees is so crucial, but it's also really hard because we don't have the pots that we're now developing for the future in place. So we've got 10 years of Nature for Climate funding as part of our community forest in terms of maintenance, and 30 of biodiversity net gain, and we really need to make them work hard for us. But as I say, we need to be adaptable. We are good at that in local authorities. We're used to having budget challenges. There is no silver bullet, but there are a number of things that we can do to bring money to this space. Next slide, please. So firstly, let's use our resources, and the people ones is what I'm talking about first. So this is a really nice list of people who work with us to try and deliver our urban estate. And actually that mix of people also help with the funding, because we can't apply as a local authority for certain things that our partners may be able to. They bring resources, they bring match funding, and they're a really crucial part of the toolkit when we're looking at funding the urban forest. Next slide, please. So government funding, I think we're all waiting with bated breath to see what happens with the CSR and how they're going to continue to fund the government's tree planting target. We're really fortunate as part of the community forest. We're looking collectively for that Nature for Climate 2 funding, but there's also loads of other funding streams that come out of government, so Forestry Commission's UCO, land management funds, and so I think we're all waiting to see what happens with those, but also once they do come through, how we can use those to set us up as in a legacy position, so that that reliance on government funding remains, but it's lessened. I think in terms of the enhanced environmental benefits, which have been covered numerous times, making sure urban planting is understood by all parts of government is going to be key for that. So we discuss it with Homes England, we discuss it with MHCLG, and that's key. And that really feeds into the last point about place-based, because we need all parts of government, all parts of local authority to want to put trees in when they deliver. Next slide, please. So local authorities, okay, our money was like this small to start with, and now it's this small, so I know the pressure that it's under. And therefore, what we need to do is make sure that local authorities value this. So even if they don't have the cash themselves, they're really supportive of the teams that go out and get that money to help, and ensure that it's really being used to keep those skills in-house as far as is humanly possible, because it is people that make the change. So we do need to look at legacy, and we do need to make sure those wider benefits are understood, because even if local government budgets aren't going to go up, then valuing the teams that deliver this work is really important. Next slide, please. So charities, local authorities can only do so many things, and these are some examples, and I'm happy to share these slides of other things that we can do with our partners. We have the Woodland Trust and the National Trust sit alongside us in the community forest, and using and playing to our strengths, whether it's ring fence funds, match funding, ways into corporates, or quite frankly, piloting or copying other people is a really good way of building that blended model. Next slide, please. Developer funding will always be part of the mix, and I think now that we have biodiversity net gain, we have our Ocean City Nature that's delivering our habitat banking vehicle. That is a new way, and it is really powerful if we can make this work. And we've done lots of webinars on our HBV, but very happy again to share those, because it is part of a new mix with developments. We'll always use Section 106, we'll always expect them to deliver gain, but if we can put HBV in the mix, it's yet another tool. And with local authorities, we can do that really credibly and make sure it is no way greenwashing, but actually driving a real change. Next slide, please. And sponsorship, we have to look really broadly. We've been looking at the opportunities for how we would do that in Plymouth, and it is about being adaptable. It's looking at new opportunities, and this is definitely something that we'll be looking at in Plymouth. I'm sure it would work in other urban places as well. Next slide, please. And corporate responsibility, the demand is definitely going up in this space. So we are working with our existing partners who have funds linked to corporates, but we're also obviously following Finance Earth's presentation, really looking at this urban tree token in the same way we're looking at our seagrass token. Ultimately, we need lots of tools, and for us, Ocean City Nature is going to be one of the future ones to enable us to transition to a really blended model. Next slide, please. So the key points: never do it on your own. So many benefits of working in partnership and really harnessing that the different strengths and what we can bring to the table. We do need to be really adaptable. Things happen quickly. We need pipelines. We need to be ready to go, and that does require us to keep those core skills in place. We are going to have to be innovative, but there's lots of things going on. We don't all have to reinvent the wheel. We need to make sure that those trees are seen as something for place. So it is about delivering for the city, for the people in it, by delivering high quality tree environments. And ultimately, we all need to do this quicker with less resource. So that learn and share and that need to transition and pioneer where you can, but quite frankly, take and copy where you can't, is really going to all move us forward faster. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we have a lively question section. So if anyone has questions, continue putting it in the chat, and we're kind of going through as many as we can in the next few minutes. I'll kick off with what are some of the practical steps to be able to take the evidence from Elizabeth and John and turn it into a funding ask at a local authority level? So each of you can kind of add a bit of flavor to this, but Kat, maybe if we kick off with you, since you have the local authority angle.
Well, we have worked with Finance Earth to take it from conceptual. So yes, I mean, I think it is not being afraid if it's outside your usual area. When we first started working with Finance Earth, quite frankly, we didn't understand what they were saying for the first 6 months, and they persevered and we got better. So, it is at a basic level, understanding your place so you know what your data is, coming up with your pipeline you want to deliver, and then working with the likes of Finance Earth and others to work out the model that fits with that. And I think once you get that bit right, going through the often tortuous routes of local authority, cabinet planning, scrutiny, etc., to get those decisions made, becomes much easier because you're really credible with what you're asking. And I think one of the things with local authorities having a lot less money, is actually they're a bit less risk averse. So they are looking at taking forward things we might not have done 10 years ago. But ultimately, it's like try something new and you might deliver something great, or stay where we are and we know what the answer is. So I think in some ways, when things are difficult, it really opens up that innovation.
John, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I really enjoyed that presentation, Kath. That was excellent. And you seem to be very well connected within the authority. Sort of everyone sort of lined up in the same game, and that's not the case everywhere. I think one of the challenges is getting other departments and colleagues and elected members on board. And what we've seen is, as you said, getting the data lined up. If you've got good data, and if you can relate that data to things as simple as the wards where elected members are based, there's 3 for each ward, you open that up and you make it public domain, at least reveal it to them. They start to pay attention. Why have you got more trees than me? How come there are more trees over there than I've got where my residents live? My voters should have what you've got. That starts a debate. It doesn't answer it, but it starts the right conversation. I think just opening up the information is a very powerful way of getting things moving, and then the answers will start to come.
Sorry, I have a bit of a cough, so if I cough it, but yes, as Kat said, we've been very happy to work with Plymouth and others, and I think the key point is that first step is really deciding what you want, in general, what you want to do, but then getting specific. The map that Kat brought up with kind of the visual of where there's different forest cover, etc., and as John is saying, understanding what that looks like, and then prioritizing where you want to take action. That's the key first step to then start to gather the data that's needed, excuse me, that can be used to build out that business case going forward. So that's a really crucial first piece.
And Kat, how did you and your team start getting your heads wrapped around the complexity of Finance Earth's language and technical information? You're muted.
Sorry, through lots of patience to start with, and then a kind of translation of like, oh, when you say that in our world, you mean this. So I think ultimately we understood our place, and Finance Earth helped us translate that into the finance world, if you like, and we learned along the way. I mean, this did not happen overnight, but I think one of the things that was really important as part of that Future Parks Accelerator work, which is kind of precursor to the Nature Towns and Cities, is that we shared it. So we went down all sorts of rabbit holes that were like, oh, we don't know what that is, and come back out that nobody else needs to do. So hopefully, that people can now progress along that same route much quicker, watch webinars, look at all those kind of things, so that, we want everyone to get where we are as quickly as possible, because it does open up so many more opportunities. And ultimately, I think with things like BNG, looking at nature and climate investment, it's like we need to capture this now and make it something that really works for places. And we have that opportunity probably for the next couple of years to shape this market so it really, really supports people and places.
And a follow-up from that. So there's a couple of questions from representatives for local authorities asking, with the uncertainty of government funding at the moment, what practical steps would you guys recommend to upskill your staff into looking at new income streams from private finance?
Nice start. So yeah. There's loads on internet now. So we know training budgets are really tight now, and getting about. I know there's often training travel bans. But there is a lot on the internet now. So if you look around a lot of these things, there's some really good webinars. You can follow models, and I think doing that collectively as a group is quite helpful, because even if you don't get it, if your colleague gets it, and then you can explain it, and then. Because ultimately you need to take the tools and then make it work for your place. It's not like pick it up and just drop it. It doesn't replicate like that. What you do is you take your toolkit and you go to your place, and then you make it work for your place. So it's a really good, I think, skills and training if you've got a couple of people in your team that you can do it together, because you can also put, in addition to learning, you're starting to develop your own project for your own area.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think as Kat said, there's a lot of resources as well, even the links that David has put that are available from the Urban Forest Accelerator, but also the precursor and all of those tools are available. But then what can be really helpful is taking a specific area and looking at kind of running through an example yourself. So as Kat said, as a team to say, okay, this area, who might be interested around here? Where is there a property developer, for example, that we know is going to be needing some sort of, whether that's BMG or looking at other outcomes like I talked about before, that they could be interested in starting to structure around a specific example can be really helpful.
I was going to just to add, I think one of the things we said know your place. I think the other bit that goes alongside that is know your organization. So you have, fairly departments who have their own goals. They open up big funding pots. You look at the list of things that Elizabeth went through. A lot of those things actually sit within other departments. These might be part of the answer, but the goal is sitting in health or in education or somewhere else. Understanding what their goals are gives you a partner to work with internally, and already you've broadened the base of people to drive the thing and you can start moving forward.
Thank you. Now, John, I've got a specific one for you, and that's where do you realistically see taking your work next? So is it going to be at a national level or kind of still going place to place to kind of fill the map?
You mean the type of work that I showed today? That's a good question. We've been debating it. So one thought was kind of repeating it in much more depth, where we are taking it down to LSRA level and tying it in more data. As you can appreciate, that was fairly high level piece of work, fairly broad brush, but gives quite a good steer. And then the other end, which is not so much national as picking off key cities, actually was the other option. So those are the two things under discussion. I'll put it that way.
Thank you. For everyone, thoughts on how the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures will have an impact on local authorities and others being able to attract income?
Yeah, happy to jump in here. I mean, it's going to be very helpful. So I think the number of signatories, and if it becomes mandatory, even more helpful. It's not voluntary, but obviously if it follows the same trajectory as the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures, that will be really useful because then corporates will need to be mapping where their impacts and dependencies are. And so that's then can look at, where for a water company, they will need to be looking at that water catchment and any negative impacts that they're having and how they're addressing those negative impacts, which then might equate to tree planting, which then can reduce runoff into that water catchment. They can be investing in that green infrastructure instead of gray infrastructure. And so that can be a way that then they report on in their reporting aligned with TNFD. So it's a great, I know a number of corporates are just at the initial stages. They've signed up as signatories, but they're still trying to figure out exactly what are all of their impacts and dependencies. So I still think we're probably a few years out, or at least a year out from those budgets really starting to flow, but at least there's the starting point for corporates getting their head around all of those range of areas.
I mean,
for us, well, we're seeing quite a lot of companies starting to enter the space because of EU regulations as well. So as kind of the corporate sustainability reporting directive comes in, they're starting to want to get their ducks in a row. So starting to have these conversations. Kat, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a local authority point of view, what it is doing is generating the demand, and therefore we need to be ready with the kind of the products, if you like, that can feed into those. I think the other thing it's doing is just getting corporates to think differently. I know our local utilities company has now got a green first policy in place, and I think it's not one tool that's pushing them, it's a lot of them coming together at the same time. And actually, as part of that, we're looking at holding water in our green spaces, but as part of that project, there's a lot of tree planting proposed. So, these really start joining together, and I think there's quite a lot of momentum coming around the demand. I think what we need to raise, and I've raised this with a number of corporates, is they need to put some funding into the development pipeline. Otherwise, they're going to have a big demand and all this money sat there and no pipeline of projects for them to take on. And I think that's the bit we need to solve, because that's the money that needs to go into local authorities to develop those pipelines to meet that demand.
John, anything to add?
Only at a high principle level of, I think just shining a light and being more transparency is generally a good thing. You open up information and people react to it, and stuff happens that you had not anticipated, because now people can do something with the information that's newly available. I think it's just a good thing.
Thank you. All right, I've got a final one. I think then our time is up if David's going to kick us out. And that's, so we've all touched on the reality of, even if people are interested and you start getting them on board with the idea of paying for trees, the sheer cost of urban trees and what's needed in different locations often is a barrier. So I just thought, leaving it with each one of you for a tip of advice on how to convert someone to give at the higher cost when there are so many different tree options in front of them. A challenge for you all.
Well, I think one key is to look at where you can be, as I said, not just thinking about water benefits, but really looking at the range of benefits and how you can be quantifying and reporting on those benefits. So that's where data is crucial, but that opens up a much wider pool of potential corporates that could be paying, and at a much higher price. So where you can be quantifying and saying, you know, by creating this urban green space, we're going to be increasing property value by X. Going to property developers with that proposition, you can be asking for much higher sums than if you're just asking for, you know, a CSR kind of donation from a local supermarket or whatnot. So there's ways to target higher levels of funding by being strategic about the outcomes that you're going to be reporting on associated with the urban green space interventions.
I think part of it is about showing that actually it's not expensive. We're comparing like planting in green spaces to other types of infrastructure, and actually compared to a roundabout, it's really cheap. And I always tease my highways colleagues that all they do is get traffic to move from A to B faster, whereas actually we can manage flood risk, help with air quality, allow people a healthier, you know, benefit wise, it's huge. And I think that's one of the bits around the data that's really exciting. Is not only can you show the value, you can show the cost benefit. And, you know, even with using the government's rules about doing the cost benefit analysis, this kind of infrastructure way outstrips grey infrastructure in terms of what it delivers. And I think the more we can use that to say actually it's cheap rather than it's expensive helps with that argument as well.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I think just to add, the more expensive it is to plant the tree, that tends to go with where the people are, and the benefits, they just multiply and multiply when you put the trees next to the people. At the top, Cecil talked about proximity as one of the key levers for understanding how we plant trees. It's golden. The benefits we get are about putting the trees where the people are, and that's where we get the big multipliers. So in terms of corporate money coming in, that's where they get the most bang for their buck when they're looking at managing their reputation. They put the trees where the customers are. It's about trees and people together.
Phenomenal. And what a note to end on. Plant where the people are. All right, David, I'll stop talking now. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. That was great. And yeah, despite the end of the day, sort of managed to sustain attendance defiantly. I don't think I'll be telling a highways engineer that all they do is get people from A to B faster, but I think it's a very persuasive argument, Kat. So yeah, and just a final thank you to all of our speakers. It's been a really strong showing from many of the contributors to the project, but there have been many more who've all put in a lot of work to develop everything that you can see in the toolkit. So please go and explore that. Let us know what you think, what you'd like to see added. Yeah, it's felt at times like almost impossible to disentangle all of this content into 4 neat themes. We almost just had a whole jumble of information there for you, but I think today there's been a really brilliant representation of how interlinked everything is, but how we can draw really strong lessons from all of that. So you can sign up to the Nature Towns and Cities mailing list at this email address here, naturetownsandscities.org.uk. For email, just of general information, you can email info@naturetownsandcities.org.uk. But as we try to move beyond this project into future collaboration and try and build momentum with our partners, we're looking to establish a group of places to start putting all of this into practice. So if your town or city is interested in regenerating, creating, expanding more equitable urban forests, please also feel free to email me directly. That is my email address there. Thank you all for attending. We really appreciate the time. And we'll close. Thanks.